business partner of some of the region's biggest retailers. But his original vision would have seen him become their competitor.
Slightly more than 5 years ago, I was running kind of an e-commerce company, small e-commerce company, selling online, primarily in Singapore. And every time we had an online customer, we went, wow, that's really easy to get a customer in no shop, nothing required. But the pain only hit after that when we had to deliver the parcel. So many issues came up. I think the entire logistics industry was just not set up for e-commerce at that point in time. So foolishly, I said, why don't we open a logistics company to solve this problem?
Welcome back to Squawk Box. The futures at this hour, we just looked at them, and we were actually looking at the futures instead of the implied open, and now the implied open is where the futures were. So we are now down 300 points. Futures down even more, as you can see, 406. So we got to decide which we want to show. There's an implied open. And Mike Santola has more on the latest market moves. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Joe. Yeah, and that's really indicative of just how how this market is basically jumping all over the place at a moment's notice. The futures trading at such a big divide from the closing index level. I did want to take a look. We've been pointing out this two-year chart of the S&P 500. Yesterday, of course, finally did kind of break down below that December 2018 low in the S&P around 2350. It seemed like we were getting too close to it not to at least try. Now, this has not been a market that has rewarded a fine comb reading of exactly all the little clues that the market gives up. But I can point out a few things from yesterday. One, it did rally late to close above that old 2018 low level. We did have fewer new lows than we did last Thursday. We closed above where we did last Thursday. So if you think about it, it's been about a week's market time where we've been trying to hash around a similar range here with very volatile moves. I would also point out, speaking of volatility, the VIX on a one-year basis, it's still amazingly elevated. It's above 70, but it did not make another high. So it's trying to sort of say maybe this is an area where we get the selling just tiring out a little bit. By the way, an 80 VIX statistically implies about a 5 to 6% daily market move. So if you move less than 5%, the VIX is probably going to bleed down. That's kind of the crazy times we're in right now. And one final thing is, it's really about the non-stock markets. Can the Fed actions backstopping money markets and commercial paper calm down and liquefy those funding markets? If so, then there's a shot at maybe the stock market finding some better footing here.
Mike, you do have a home. I thought you lived in that marble envelope down at the NYSE.
Right. They evicted me from the pod there. Yeah, I'm just waiting for them to deliver the big plasma touchscreen here.
So that you with
that's what I'm saying. You missed your telestrator because you're talking with your hands.
Yeah, that's right. Are you with? Are you crashing at a friend's house or something? Or so that was all. None of that was true yesterday. You have your own there. You have a place. That's good.
Yeah. Well, some people have two homes. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Meantime, the Senate has approved what they're calling Phase 2 of the coronavirus relief package. That package includes free testing for the virus as well as paid emergency leave. But not everyone in the Senate was on board with the relief measure. Joining us right now on the phone is Senator Marsha Blackburn, one of 8 who voted against. Senator, how are you?
I am doing well. Thank you.
Lots of questions given the health and now economic crisis that this is turning into about your decision. Can you explain it?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the provisions in the bill dealt with Medicaid and testing. And for states that were non-expansion states on Medicaid, it adversely impacted our state, and Tennessee is one of those. Another had to do with the paid family leave. This is something that our small businesses, and I talked to dozens of small businesses, and this is something that makes it very difficult for them. I was talking with a small business owner last night and going back through the provisions with him, and he said, you know, there are a lot of people like me that are just going to have to lay people off. And so they were in the process of looking at that, the reason being it was something that they could not afford to do. And they were not prepared for this. They had healthy businesses. We are very concerned about keeping these small businesses open, keeping their doors open, getting money to independent contractors, sole proprietors. We have a lot of people that work in the entertainment touring business, the venue business. I talked with theme parks yesterday, and, you know, there are some concerns with how this was going to adversely impact. I'm one of those. I supported using the payroll tax cut, the unemployment insurance system. That employment security system is in place. It is integrated, and that would have been my preference. And I think we have to realize, too, we did the $8.3 billion. That was the first package out. Then the second package was the $50 billion that came through with the emergency declaration. Right. This was the third package, and now we're working on a fourth
Well, that's
package.
what I was going to say, Senator. I mean, this is going to be a patchwork of packages over time,
That's correct.
Clearly.
That's correct.
But part of the question, therefore, is, and maybe you knew going in that this was going to be, that being against it meant it was still going to go forward. So I don't know.
We're still trying. That's right. We're still trying to work these provisions out. I was talking with CMS last night. We are trying to work out this paid leave so that these small businesses do not have to shut down. We need them to be able to come roaring back because we have got to defeat this. This came out of Wuhan, China. They knew they had it. They were not transparent. We've all heard those stories. We've got to defeat this, and we've got to preserve the economy. So, you know,
Senator, let me ask you about a different idea. I had written a piece in the New York Times yesterday, Senator, that effectively suggested we create a bridge loan for every company in America, full stop. And this could cost trillions as long as you keep 90% of your employees on the payroll. Senator Schumer was just asked about that plan that I wrote about on Morning Joe. I want to play you what he had to say.
I'm all for it with one caveat. That loan can be forgiven if and only if they keep all their employees.
All their employees.
You don't want to give them, yes, you don't want to give them a loan and then they fire half the employees and they're out of work. But again, it's something that we're working on. Mark Warner on our side of the aisle is doing a good job coming up with a plan. We've been talking to not only Mnuchin on this, but Powell, but it's a very good idea.
My plan kept 90%. He's saying 100%. What's the number for you?
This is something that I think you look at things in three buckets. You have health assistance, food assistance, and financial assistance. And what you need to do is stabilize and assist to the point that you can bridge this gap because these companies did nothing wrong. Now, zero interest SBA loans is something that we are working on right now so that people have the ability to bridge this period of time, whether it ends up being 2 months or 3 months or 6 months.
But do you believe that those loans should only be made if companies keep their employees on the payroll, or are you prepared to make those loans irrespective?
There should be criteria, and there should be criteria with keeping people on the payroll. I have talked to some businesses who said, look, especially in the restaurant industry, we've got, I think it is 15 million people that work in the restaurant industry every day. And they had moved to patio seating. They were doing maintenance and repairs that needed to be done inside the restaurant. They were doing certain cleaning. They had set up takeout and delivery. So they have adjusted to keep people on the payroll.
Right.
Keeping people working, I think, is an important component.
What do you make of bailouts for larger companies? Obviously, we're talking about the airlines. We're talking about Boeing. But also, we're talking about the cruise line industry, which is not technically domiciled in the United States, doesn't pay taxes in the United States. What should happen?
Well, what we have to look at is not only those major employers, but the system that supports them. And I'll give you an example. When you talk about the cruise line industry, then what about all of these inspirational, motivational speakers, these entertainers and musicians that are coming out of Nashville and out of Tennessee, and they have lost every single one of their bookings for the next 4 months. Their income went from healthy to zero. So you can't just segment it and say, like,
is there something, though, that we should be asking for? Because the other issue is, and I think the 2008 crisis proved this, the politics of bailouts are ugly. And the distrust and anger it can create is remarkable. And so when it comes to the cruise line industry, I am 100% with you in terms of the knock-on effects of that and the need to try to mitigate that. But the question is, therefore, do you say to the cruise line industry, we will back you if you move back to the United States and you decide to pay taxes to the United States? Or do you believe we ultimately need to get equity stakes or some kind of warrant or convertible debt for all of the loans that we will be making if they're going to be made on an idiosyncratic industry-by-industry basis?
We are, as we work today on what is going to be this third package, you're going to see conversation around these various industries. Airline industry included, airline cargo, and of course general aviation is a component of that. And I think there will be talk about how we collateralize those loans and how we work with them, because what they've asked for is a $50 billion safety net, if you will. And the particulars, Chairman Wicker is working on this. Some of us at Commerce Committee, we continue to talk with these airline CEOs. What we want to do is make certain they can continue to fly, and then as soon as we get on the downside of this virus, that we're able for them to come roaring back. And again, we have to bear in mind that this is unlike the packages that came in place after Katrina or different storms, or after the 2008 crisis and the package in 2010. We have to remember, this is something that came out of another country. It came from Wuhan, China. They withheld information, and it has caused a global pandemic.
Senator, I would prefer to put this in the Katrina category, prefer to put it in the 9/11 category. And the reason I say that is, but if you put it, I agree, it's not 2008, because we can describe that's a man-made crisis. The question, therefore, is, in a natural disaster, what taxpayers should be getting for their money or not, and whether there should be some kind of upside if, in fact, the economy returns. There's obviously so much commotion and investors out there who say, look, the airline spent, billions and billions of dollars on buybacks with no rainy day fund or kitty, and we are effectively privatizing the losses, or rather privatizing the gains and socializing the losses.
Correct. And as I said yesterday on the floor, sometimes it is good to pause and see where we are. And I know my buddy Art Lapper, who you all talk with periodically, that he has said sometimes you need to just take a deep breath. And as we move, and as I said, this package that came through yesterday had problems that, like, we're going to pick winners and losers. And I do not want small business to be a loser. I do not want the non-expansion Medicaid states to be a loser. I am terribly concerned about the health of the economy and the health of citizens, and want to make certain that the decisions that I make is going to be there to help us recover in the most expeditious fashion.
All right. Senator, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. Always enjoy talking to you, and wish you a lot of luck over these next days and weeks.
Well, we're working hard on it, and I also have the bill with Senator Menendez that would bring pharmaceutical manufacturing back to the U.S. And this is something that I'm continuing to work with the White House and the Vice President's office and leadership, Senate leadership on.
Another project to discuss the next time we speak. Appreciate it very, very much. Got to send it over to the Quick Bureau. Becky.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Let's take a look at the futures because the situation is worsening this morning. Remember, overnight we had seen the futures up by the Dow futures up by over 550 points. That was coming as the ECB made these big moves, but we've given all that back and then some. Dow futures are now implied down by almost 500 points, so a swing of about 1,000 points this morning or so, even more than that, in these futures. When we come back, we have more on the latest on the coronavirus and your money. We'll be speaking with legendary investor Ray Dalio of Bridgewater Associates coming up in just a little bit. Don't forget, you can always watch us on the go on the CNBC app. Squawk Box will be right back.
Changing the way we eat.
I didn't know that plant-based burger was going to really be this good.
To lab-grown meat.
Few cells from an animal. Bathe those cells in nutrients, we'll end up with exactly the same meat, but produced in a much more efficient way.
The global food industry is changing, and we are all being urged to eat better for a greener planet.
Consumers today want to be supported in making the right choices.
That's all coming up on the next episode of Sustainable Energy.
If I could just get a hand vote on a universal digital tax, I wouldn't say there was a majority in the room for one way or the other.
Do it properly within the multilateral context.
It is a proportionate tax. It will fall away once there is an international solution.
If people want to just arbitrarily put taxes on our digital companies, we'll consider arbitrarily putting taxes on car companies.
It's like a Damocles sword hanging over Europe.
We can do what we can to avoid tariffs.
Are you concerned about the threat of a trade fight? Every customer we have is focused on that.
You're a European company that could be collateral damage in a trade war.
They're not getting paid for being frustrated. The US government has been very decisive.
I was very optimistic about the signals I was getting from the meeting between Trump and Ursula von der Leyen.
This is a time for a global agreement and not for global dispute.
Europe is adapting to retaliation measure. I'm partner with Turkey. If we don't get something, I'm going to have to take action. They're going to make a deal because they have to.
Opening bell action and reaction.
Global markets under some pressure this morning.
The first trade.
Financials are the best performers right now.
The first analysis.
Is there a risk here? Look at these stocks.
Squawk on the Street. Weekdays on CNBC.
Three companies out with quarterly results are commenting on the potential impact of the coronavirus. Darden Restaurants beat estimates on the top and bottom lines. Same-store sales nearly doubled estimates. However, it's withdrawn guidance, forward guidance, as opposed to backward guidance. It's withdrawn forward guidance due to the virus outbreak and said so far this quarter, same as for restaurant sales are down 5.9%. that backward guidance is they're much more accurate typically because, as Yogi Berra once said, that the predictions are hard, especially about the future. Home builder Lennar reported much better than expected earnings and revenue for its most recent quarter. Also withdrew forward guidance and said it was focused on maintaining a strong balance sheet and the virus impact. And consulting firm Accenture beat Wall Street forecasts for both earnings and revenue. It did not withdraw its guidance, giving an estimate that is just slightly below consensus. However, it did say the ultimate result depends on many factors it may not be able to predict, Andrew.
Thank you, Joe. Meantime, I want to get the latest headlines on the coronavirus pandemic. Rahel Solomon joins us now with more on that. Good morning.
Hi, Andrew. Good morning. So globally, total cases top 219,000. More than 8,900 people have died. In the U.S., the number of cases stands at 9,400 with 150 deaths. And in what could be a turning point for the outbreak, China now reporting 0 local new infections. They did report 34 new cases, but officials say that those were from visitors. And as calls grow louder for young people to follow federal recommendations to self-distance to try to prevent the spread of the virus, we're now learning about how they're impacted. So according to the CDC, of the 508 people hospitalized by the virus, 20% were between the ages of 20 and 44. 12% of those in intensive care were within that same age bracket that's considered the millennial generation. And here in New York, the state with the highest number of confirmed cases, coronavirus cases stand at more than 2,300. Positive results jumped by 1,000 in 24 hours, according to Governor Andrew Cuomo. And that spike is largely in part because more people are being tested. However, Governor Cuomo also said that he thinks the actual number of cases even higher than what we now know. Becky, I'll send it over to you.
All right, Rahel, thank you very much. Joining us right now is Dr. Mark McClellan. He's with the Duke School of Business. He's a professor there. Of course, he's also the former commissioner of the FDA. And, Doctor, thank you for being with us this morning.
Becky, good to be with you.
What Rahel just said, this idea that there are 0 new cases that originated in China as of today for the first time, how significant is that?
It's significant. It shows that with extreme but important steps, non-medical steps to control the spread of the virus, it can make a real difference. China is different from the United States, but other countries, including Singapore and Korea, have also made progress. The kinds of steps that we've implemented in recent days approach the kinds of non-medical social distancing, isolation steps that have made a real difference in some of these other places.
You know, your head kind of gets turned and flipped in different directions every day. Yesterday, Singapore actually announced that it had new cases. I saw a couple other countries that did as well, and that was very concerning. So you go from this super concern to, okay, maybe it's better news in China. How do you read through this?
Well, it is concerning. There will be more cases, especially here in the United States. As you just said, there's a lot more testing going on here. That's really important to get a handle on just how much exposure we have in different places around the country. So the number of cases is going to go up significantly here. You will see blips in cases in other places around the world too, like Singapore, but that is good when it's a sign you've got great testing in place and the capacity to do immediate follow-up. The other thing that I would be watching, besides the increasing number of cases around the United States in the coming days, is the increased number of hospitalizations and serious cases. That's a marker of just how well we're controlling the underlying incidence of the virus in this country, and hopefully the steps that we're taking now are going to show some slowing in the growth of those cases in the coming days in many parts of the country.
When do you think this will peak?
Oops, sorry. Without the denominator.
Go ahead.
I wouldn't make a comment at this point about when exactly it will peak. It depends on what we continue to do. So more diagnostic testing, more steps towards more steps like the ones we're taking now around physical distancing and social isolation. It's really hard, but I think we'll be able to see how much impact that's having in the coming days to next few weeks. Behind that, we've really got to accelerate our efforts to develop treatments, since that's what's ultimately going to get this virus under complete control.
So, Dr. McClellan, because we don't have a denominator and because we're late on testing and we're trying to figure out the denominator, that hospital anecdotal evidence from emergency rooms or from ICUs is a big deal for us to know. Can we take any? I mean, I would hope that since we haven't seen just the huge influx that we're worried about, I'd like to take that as a positive. But what if a lot of people are asymptomatic or just minor symptoms and they're not even self-quarantining? Then I don't feel quite I don't feel quite as optimistic. No, go ahead.
Exactly, and that's why the steps you were describing earlier about millennials, about others taking steps to socially distance, to follow the recommendations from the Surgeon General and others in government is really important right now. So how well we do with those steps is going to determine whether we can slow down the overall incidence of cases and slow down the number of serious cases, which are going to show up in hospitals and emergency rooms. That's what we've got to really watch in the coming days.
My big millennial fans are angry that we're saying it's the millennials down in Florida. It's the Generation Z, I think is what they're called. They're the spring breakers, so maybe the millennials are getting a bad rap. They're self-quarantining in their parents' basement, I'm told. So.
Well, it's really all Americans that have to take these steps together. We're all in our cities, our towns, our neighborhoods together. So what we do together really matters. I've seen lots of positive examples as well. People following the social distancing rules, helping each other out, connecting. That's really important in the next few days.
Dr. McClellan, very quickly, General Motors CEO Mary Barra offered to start making ventilators in the factories there that aren't being used to produce cars right now. Good idea?
Good idea to explore. You know, now is a time to think about the surge capacity. That includes ventilators, but it also includes telemedicine. So for people with less severe conditions, getting treated outside of the hospital, and maybe looking at other options like unoccupied hotels for more intermediate cases, people who do need monitoring and support, but maybe not hospital or ventilator level care.
Dr. Mark McClellan, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Okay, coming up, Bridgewater Associates' Ray Dalio joins us for his take on the market volatility we've been seeing. Plus, we're going to have the latest on bailout prospects for Boeing. The aerospace giant stock has fallen about 68% year-to-date. It's back below 100 pre-market, down over 6 points, facing a global drop-off in demand for air travel, as well as the grounding of its 737 MAX planes. Much more after the break. Stay with us.
They said it will never work. We still hear it all the time. But we built it anyway, client by client, market by market, for bonds, derivatives, money markets, ETFs, and equities, into a global electronic trading network that connects every part of the financial community. That's second to none. It will never work? Well, now it does.
Set your money on track with Nancy Hungerford and Denver Gill. Get up to speed with the day's biggest moves, real-time updates, actionable insights, street signs on CNBC.
That we're most familiar with today is shareholder capitalism. This concept has been embraced by the world's business leaders for decades. The main idea? Make money for your investors. The theory originated from American economist Milton Friedman in the 1970s. He argued that maximizing profits for shareholders should be a corporation's only objective, while still following the law, of course. Corporate boards overwhelmingly took on the message and made sense at the time. American companies had become bloated and unprofitable. Shareholder activism became a movement, and leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher stood behind it. The fall of the Soviet Union solidified the message. The mantra later became greed is good. Many economists agree this form of capitalism had its advantages. Hundreds of millions of people benefited in the following decades as profit-seeking companies opened up new markets and created new jobs. But now, more and more voices are saying we've gone too far in the other direction.
Breaking news, central banks on both sides of the Atlantic digging deep as the coronavirus ravages markets around the world. Meantime, President Trump okays billions of dollars for paid sick leave and more virus testing, with potentially $1 trillion more on the way for American workers. And the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, some of America's biggest malls and Detroit's big three automakers will temporarily shut down operations to stem the spread of the virus. This hour, famed investor Ray Dalio and President Trump's former top economic advisor Gary Cohn will help us make sense of the volatility on Wall Street, the government's response, and when investors can expect to see a light at the end of the tunnel. CNBC's special coverage of the coronavirus crisis and the markets in turmoil begins right now.
Good morning, I'm Joe Kernan, along with Becky Quick and Andrew Ross Sorkin. U.S. equity futures at this hour are seeing some of the lowest levels of the session since we got here, but maybe before we were here, I think it was even lower through the night. But we're now indicated down 402 points, 397 on the Dow. For a while this morning, the NASDAQ was positive, but indicated to open positive, now indicated down about 60, and the S&P indicated down about 43 or so. Treasury yields have moved above 1% and are still there, 1.13. And the other big story today is oil prices, which are rebounding from multi-year lows, 18-year lows, really now up almost 9%, but at $22 a barrel. And check out the dollar. We'll take a quick look. We don't always do this, but as you can see, dollar index has been gaining throughout most of the pre-market session.
Okay, meantime, in just the last 24 hours, we've seen more historic moves by both the federal government and bankers in Europe to fight the economic damage from the coronavirus. And we've got team coverage of it all morning, along with an update on Boeing, which has seen its stock plunge and is now seeking billions of dollars in government assistance. But we're going to begin this morning with Eamon Javers in Washington on the new emergency funding we're hearing about from Congress. Eamon.
Yeah, good morning again to you, Andrew. I'm just emailing this morning with a senior administration official who tells me that information is coming back to the administration now from Republican senators on Capitol Hill. They're going to modify their proposal. They're taking in additional ideas, I'm told, from Capitol Hill. But here's where the Phase 3 proposal stands as of now. This is as the Treasury proposed it, not necessarily as it's going to pass ultimately on the Hill. But they're talking about $50 billion in aid just to the airline industry. And then for other severely distressed sectors, $150 billion. They're looking at $300 billion in small business loans. And this would permit the use of the Exchange Stabilization Fund to guarantee money market mutual funds. So that's an important piece of this. The overall aid ultimately to individual taxpayers, they're envisioning that in two tranches of $250 billion. One payment going out starting April 6th, the other payment going out starting May 18th. So over the next couple of months, a total of $500 billion there to individual taxpayers and just checks from the government. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said they might be able to even do that in direct deposits straight to people's bank accounts because the IRS already has information, banking information for a lot of people when they do those refunds every year. So this could be a direct stimulus of $500 billion, guys. That's how it's being envisioned right now. But as I say, work in progress. We'll hear from the president at 11 a.m. He's going to FEMA later today. And of course, the Senate is going to be working and adding those details as we go along throughout the day, guys. Back over to you.
Okay. Meanwhile, we want to get over to Steve, who I think is with us, Steve Leisman, who's been looking at this situation from the Fed side.
Yeah, but also want to take a look at it from the economic side. What Eamon is reporting is very critical to the economic outlook and how much of a downturn the economy experiences and then how much of a recovery it experiences. We went out and we asked 8 forecasters for their best estimate. No false precision here, as somebody suggested. Look, everybody says these are the best estimates that our models could put out, given the information. We just want to provide you with the median estimates of the economists, and it is not a pretty picture, at least for the second quarter. A very slight downturn expected in the first quarter. Remember, we're still in it now, so some of that March is going to affect the first quarter, which had been running 1.5% to 2%. Then you get this very ugly downturn, 8% in the second quarter, followed by the best guesses right now, 4% roughly in the third and fourth quarter. So not a tremendous V shape there, but it's not an L, as you guys were talking about. Now let's take a look, and I'll show you a very wide range of estimates that shows the imprecision here. You have JP Morgan with an historic 14% decline in the second quarter, and then you have some folks in the middle there, like Deutsche Bank and Oxford Economics, Amherst Bank of Tokyo, right at the median there at 8%, Goldman at -5, all the way to Zandy at Moody's at -3.2. Here's a commentary from JP Morgan. They say, we expect spillover effects to last in the third quarter. That's a critical part of it, counteracting the support to growth from activity coming back online. Crucially, we expect a vigorous policy response to partially offset these negatives. Okay, let's take a look and let's put this in some kind of context. Here are your worst quarters ever of the post-war period. 1958, I guess they called that the Eisenhower recession, -10%. There's the financial recession, -8.4%. The 1980-82 double dip recession provided a couple bad ones, and again in 1953. So that's why we had those two backstops, among other things, by the Fed last night. That's why Eamon's reporting what he's talking about. A new money market mutual fund backstop from the Federal Reserve. And then second, the ECB coming in last night with 750 billion euros. Guys, I don't think we're done yet with the programs from the Fed or obviously the administration here.
Okay. Steve, thank you so very much for that. Joining us right now to talk more about the fallout for investors, the economy from this coronavirus, and what it will take to get the U.S. economy back on track afterwards. We are joined on the telephone this morning by hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, chairman and founder of Bridgewater Associates. Ray has spent an awful amount of time over the years studying the world of crises. He's written a book about it called The 2008 Crisis, Right. This one, though, has been different. Ray, what are you thinking this morning?
Well, what I'd like to do is put it in the context of, what's happening. What's happening has not happened in our lifetimes before. And so I would like to give a template, try to reiterate how the machine works, and then bring it to today. So I just want to take a moment and say, just from the big picture, there's productivity. Over a period of time, we invent, we learn more, we learn how to do things better, and our living standards rise. And then there were two big cycles around that. There's a short-term debt cycle, which is the usual business cycle that goes on 8 or 10 years. And then there's the long-term debt cycle that comes along once in everybody's lifetime. It goes back to, the Bible talked about every 50 years and so on, debt restructuring. And you and I have talked about this many times on the phone, that, which is that we have a situation in which the combination of a large wealth gap and the proximity of interest rates to zero, meaning a less effective monetary policy, and a large amount of debt outstanding, is a formula that is very similar to the 1930s, because there's a lot of debt and the capacity of monetary policy is limited. And now we're seeing that play out. So now let's bring us right into today. And what we have is a crisis. It's not caused by the usual things. But in reading history, many, many cases, there have been pandemics. I won't go into all those cases now, but I want to emphasize that we're in an economic downturn, a crisis that has a health part of it, has an economic part of it, has a monetary part of it, and we're hitting zero interest rates. And so what you're seeing right now, very basic, is the inability of central banks to stimulate monetary policy in the way that is normal. In other words, in a regular cycle, they push the button, poof, and they stimulate and give people credit. And people with money and credit, they go out and spend more and they pick up the economy. But the capacity to do that when you hit the zero interest rate floor and when monetization doesn't work anymore, because pushing interest rates will not push bond yields down. Buying bonds will not push bond yields down. And then you have the loss of interest rate declines, the loss of getting money to the people who need it through quantitative easing. When that doesn't work anymore, then you are in the position now. So very classically, right here now, what you have is the federal government, which does not have the capacity to make money and credit. You have them coming in and spending a lot more money, not nearly enough money. We estimate right now that the corporate losses would be in the vicinity of, in the U.S., about $4 trillion. Globally, probably about $12 billion.
Say that again, $4 trillion in the United States, $12 trillion globally, that's with a T?
That's right. So the size, there'll be big losses. And those are corporations. There'll also be individuals who have very big losses. And individuals who can't afford the shock that they're going to have. So there's a need for the government to spend more money, a lot more money. And where do they get
how much more money, Ray?
Well, we're going to have to, it depends on whether it's provided as loan guarantees or credits or something along those lines. I would say somewhere in the vicinity of $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion is a minimum. And what that means, where does the government get the money? Okay, who are the lenders now? Everybody's almost hit. And so the way this works, the way it's worked in history, is that they have to get the money from the Federal Reserve. So you are in a moment in time right now, you're seeing it play out. It's played out in history, it's played out in the 1930s, in which you're now seeing we're going to spend a lot of money on these programs. That means you're going to have to sell a lot of bonds. Okay, who is going to buy those bonds? A lot of people are going to be broke. A lot of, if you look at the condition of pension funds or other endowments, so where's that money going to come from? As in history, that money will have to come from the Federal Reserve. So you see it right now. When you see a big program being announced, like that program, you see the bond yield stack up. Now, if the central bank does not then go in there and buy those bonds, and the central bank at this point is in a dilemma. And what should happen with interest rates and so on? If those rates back up because the supply-demand imbalance is not good, then you're going to have the next wave of the crisis, because interest rates rising will cause asset prices to go down more again. And they also will mean that debt squeezes will be a problem, and also credit spreads would widen. This is just mechanics.
Ray, help us with this. I think a lot of investors are trying to think about, and policymakers right now, trying to think about whether this is a V-type recovery, or this is a U, or if this is an L. And when you talk about the 1930s, a V is not on the table, a U may not be on the table, an L might be what it looks like.
Yes, I'd like to go through, I'll answer your question with an explanation of essentially the mechanics. We are now at a point where there will have to be a debt, a restructuring and a monetization of that. And we're living in a different world like the 1930s, in which 1932, you have a devaluation of the dollar. You have the printing of money. In other words, 1932, Roosevelt gets elected, and then we have the hitting of zero interest rates, and you have the analogous thing. Central banks came in there and they printed money that bought financial assets. That makes the rich richer, and it puts liquidity, and it makes asset prices go up. Then you become long. Everybody right now is leverage long in the markets. In other words, most people are rooting for up, and the government is rooting for up. And the way they usually get up is by creating money and credit to push things up, but they can't do that anymore that way. So now we're dealing with a restructuring issue. So I want to emphasize that there are typically two types of investors. The first is those who get excited about what's going on at the time, and they kind of buy at the highs because they say, oh, that's great, and they extrapolate the past. And that's a problem. Then we've learned over our years, over the cycle that it's been our lifetime, we haven't learned what it was like in a prior lifetime. What we've learned since the post-World War II era is to buy breaks.
Buy the dips.
Buy the dips. In other words, we look at value in a normal way of saying, now it's down, and so you'll get value investors, in a sense, coming in. What history has shown us, that if you go back to the bigger cycles, these things that take place about 50 years when monetary policy is not all effective, is that that is a dangerous policy too. And so I think we're in a situation now with this low level, with this dynamic in which fiscal policymakers are looking at monetary policymakers, and they're trying to cut a deal, that you're seeing literally helicopter money. In other words, sending $1,000 to each person is helicopter money. If you want to read about it, it's I wrote about it in my book, which, by the way, is free online, which is Debt Crisis, this big debt crisis. There's Monetary Policy 3, which is that process. So that's the part of the cycle that we're going to be in. That issue means at some point there is a risk of what is money. What is the storehold of wealth? In other words, what happens?
Are we moving to gold? This is very pessimistic.
Again, I want to convey the mechanics of it. At such times, when you have, let's say, bond yields or returns that are very low, and but they're high on a real basis because you have deflation. You have zero rates, but you have deflation. You have a move to cash. And most investors believe that cash is the safest place. And it is over the short run at that time of deflation. But when you have that move to cash, there's a necessity to produce a lot of cash and a lot of debt. So now you will enter in a time when the bonds that you're holding, which is a promise to receive cash, they're going to produce lots of cash. And then we get into an environment of, is that a safe place for money? So the question that all investors have to ask themselves is, where is safe? You should always, basically you need to know where is safe and where is opportunity. And people think now opportunity is in being long assets and so on. And so that's why the world is leveraged long. At the same time, where is safe? And we live in a world where we think cash is safe, and cash may not be safe as we're going forward. I'm not saying now. I'm saying that as we're going through this dynamic, that we're right now at this inflection point, the inflection point in which they have the deficits and now we get the money printing and all that. If you take that a year or two or three or maybe less down the line, there will be a question of all those people who are holding what they believe are safe investments, which is the promise to receive cash. They may not believe that those returns, real returns, and that is adequate. So that's a longer term.
Ray, Let me ask you just about the immediate term right now, and I'd love to get your thoughts on something that we heard from Pershing Square's Bill Ackman. He was on CNBC yesterday. He had a sharp warning for investors. I just want to play it and then maybe get your reaction.
Hell is coming. Okay, and I felt, it's really, I've never had this experience before in my life. The closest I had was the financial crisis, where I'm saying, things are coming, bad stuff's coming. But this was a feeling like I've never had. Like there's a tsunami coming, right? The tsunami's coming in. You feel it in the air.
What do you think of what Bill just had to say, Ray?
While I think he's right, I don't think that's of much use, because it can stimulate panic rather than thoughtfulness. What I'm trying to do is to convey mechanics. I don't want people to panic. I want people to think. I want them to understand the mechanics of how this thing works so they navigate smartly, because the more things go down, the more they're going to panic, and they'll sell at the lows, and they won't understand, how to invest. What I'd like to do is just to convey the mechanics of this. By the way, if you want to see how the economic machine works on YouTube, there's a video.
You have a very good video on YouTube. But Ray, how are you at Bridgewater thinking about this? I know that you had put out a statement earlier that you hadn't anticipated this situation over the past several weeks, and like so many others, it's in the performance.
Yeah. We're down about between, depending, roughly speaking, and I don't want to get into the exact thing, somewhere in the vicinity of which fund 10 to 20%-ish kind of decline, and we missed that. We're kicking ourselves for missing that move, because you and I were talking when the downturn would come, we would encounter this, and so on. So what happened was, it didn't come from the usual places. It came from not the usual ways that downturns come. And so when we started to get information, we dealt with the question of, are we going to really trade this? We have a system. We're not going to get into pandemics and so on, and that was what has happened. I'm not going to get into our particular positions. However, I would say that what I'm describing to you here and now is the thing that we're following in terms of our strategy. And I will, I feel a responsibility to try to not give tips in the market, not do that, but a responsibility to thoughtfully convey how the economic machine works. I do that on LinkedIn if people are interested. But I want to explain the mechanics of that and then put where we are right now in that position. Because if you look at history, I'm saying right now, you could say, okay, Fed, what are you going to do about that rising interest rate? Are you going to come in with, and not just Fed, all central banks, are you going to come in with the trillions of dollars? And are you going to work with the federal government to get it to those who otherwise will go broke? Those are businesses. But there's going to be a lot of people out there who, this can be a social issue, a social conflict issue, too, in terms of the rich and the poor and how it's being treated and all those.
Ray, do you support bailouts to specific industries? Do you have views on that? In terms of the social issue that you've been talking about for the past several years, and the political ramifications and others, social issues that may come of that if people see that certain industries are bailed out. We may bail out the airline industry, but I don't know if anyone's going to bail out the Vail and the ski industry anytime soon.
I think the government is in a position in which, let's say, during the 2008 financial crisis, they could handle it more easily, and it was very difficult, but they could handle it more easily. They could go through the banks and protect the banks and protect the money market funds. And it was very controversial to protect the banks and so on. Now this problem is beyond the banking system. So imagine protecting a bunch of companies of the sort that you're asking about. Do I protect the airline? Do I protect the ski resort? Do I protect those types of things? There will be many of those that cannot be protected, and it's going to be a politically challenging thing to say, how do I get it to them, and who is protected? Talk about political controversy. This is going to be politically very, very challenging. There are abilities to do this. There are abilities to do it, but the question is whether politics will deal with it and whether central banks will coordinate well with central government in order to then think which are the entities that you would not want to lose. Just like you don't want to lose the best, which are the systemically important entities? Do you want to lose Boeing, or do you not want to lose Boeing? Do you want to lose this one, or do you not want to lose that? What are the implications? And there's a whole bunch of them. And to make those choices almost one by one is what's going to be required. And the question is, can our system do that?
Ray Dalio, it is always a privilege to spend time with you and to help our viewers through the way you're thinking about these things and the economic machine, which we've been talking about together now for almost 10 years. Thank you for joining us this morning. And as this pandemic continues, hopefully it'll abate, but as it continues, I hope we have an opportunity to talk to you again soon.
All the best to everyone.
Thank you, Ray. Becky, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's take a look at the futures again, because if you're just waking up, it's been a pretty wild ride. You're now looking at the Dow futures indicated down by about 470 points. This is something that's been all over the place. Earlier, actually overnight, you saw the futures trading up pretty sharply, more than 500 points up for the Dow after the ECB came in and announced some of the big measures that it's going to be taking. Those central bank measures, the stimulus that would be added, certainly pushed things higher, but we've given back all of that ground and then some. NASDAQ is now indicated down by about 110 points. S&P futures down by 56. And of course, this is a day after the Dow was down by 6.3%. The S&P was down by 5.1%. You got to watch this pretty closely. We'll see if we get to limits again. The near limit down yesterday. The trading was halted at one point in the afternoon. We're also watching oil, because yesterday oil prices were down 24%. That was the third worst day ever, to an 18-year low of $20.37. This morning, oil is trading higher, but not as high as we'd seen earlier in the session. It's now up by about 8%, trading right around $22 a barrel.
There are now more than 9,400 confirmed cases of the coronavirus in the United States, with 150 deaths, but also a positive development out of China, if we can believe the data. Authorities say that the city of Wuhan, where the virus is thought to have originated, as well as its surrounding province, had no new cases today. Joining us now, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner and CNBC contributor. He also serves on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina. We also heard from one of our guests earlier, Doctor, that in Italy, there may be glimmers of a second derivative of, I guess, the acceleration may be slowing. Can you add anything to the China or Italy news, and is it positive?
Well, the China news is certainly positive. I think it demonstrates that, with containment strategies, you can get through an epidemic, and we've seen that also in South Korea and Singapore. Although they've had some new cases and a resurgence, they've largely gotten control of their epidemic, and South Korea was able to do that too. In Italy, you're still seeing the number of deaths rise, but they may be approaching the peak in terms of new infections. Deaths and hospitalizations are going to rise past that peak, because their time to hospitalization is about 9 to 12 days. Time to death is, could be as long as 3 weeks, maybe longer. So people who are getting infected now or got infected last week, they're still going to go through that process. And so hospitalizations and deaths are still going to rise even past the point in which their new infections peak.
We're testing more in the United States. You've talked about that we are definitely going to find more cases now that we're testing so many people. Do you, at the same time that these numbers are going to be going up, do you expect the anecdotal evidence from emergency rooms and hospitals and ICUs, do you expect that to spike sharply?
Well, it is spiking right now. It actually started spiking about 2 weeks ago. If you were looking at the genomic surveillance data in major cities, they were showing spikes. New York City has showed a spike of people presenting with influenza-like illness who were testing negative for flu, and it was a time when flu tests had gone back to baseline. So that was an indication probably 2 weeks ago that you were already seeing a signal of increased presentation. Now, some of that was probably people who had, community pneumonia and now were presenting because they had heard about the coronavirus and were worried. But some of that was probably coronavirus now in retrospect. So we're going to continue to see that build. New York's just in the beginning phase of this, and there's other American cities that are similarly seeded that are going to go through epidemic spread right now. So we're just at the beginning of the epidemic curve here. The steps we're taking is hopefully going to limit that spread, but we're at the beginning of what we saw in China and South Korea and unfortunately Italy.
Dr. Gottlieb said that his administration will have an announcement related to the FDA today. You have any idea what that might be?
I don't know specifically, but I can tell you what I think they ought to be doing. Right now, there's a number of... First, we need a point-of-care diagnostic. We're going to need something that can do massive surveillance more easily at the point of care. And so I think we need to try to move those to the market. There's also a number of promising therapeutics, and there's no reason why we can't have a treatment for this virus. This virus is not very intricate. We've developed drugs that target the features of this virus in other settings, and so we should be able to come up with a therapeutic in a reasonable period of time. There's actually about a half a dozen or so drugs being tested in China, some of which are antiviral drugs like favipiravir that are already approved for other indications. I think what we need to do is establish a very large, what we call a treatment protocol or a master protocol. We've done this before at FDA, where you allow a number of drugs to be tested simultaneously on patients in need. In this case, patients who get into trouble in the hospitals with this disease. And you can compare the drugs and see what's working. But what you do is you basically randomize the drugs against each other, or you randomize patients based on when they started receiving the drug, rather than randomizing to placebo. So it's a study. You're going to get good data. You're going to be able to figure out what's working. It's a little bit harder to figure out what's working because of the way it's designed, but you're giving everyone a treatment. So if you have 3 or 4 or 5 treatments that all look promising, you don't know which is the best, you want to figure that out, but you also don't want to deny people who don't have an alternative, don't have an option, a treatment. So you can set up that large protocol. That's something that's been talked about. I think it's something the FDA and the administration can go forward with. And the other thing, and the third piece of this, 2 other pieces just quickly, Becky, we need a massive surveillance system. We need to be, when people present with influenza-like illness come the fall and they test negative for flu, we need to be testing literally tens of thousands of those samples for coronavirus so we can detect this early, so we don't get another outbreak or an epidemic. And the final thing we need, and we can have it, is the antibody-based prophylaxis I've talked about, an antibody drug that you can give people who are high risk of coronavirus, elderly people, people who are immunocompromised, people with pre-existing medical conditions. You can give it to them on a monthly basis and basically protect them from getting coronavirus. If we have those tools, this is something we can live with, and I think our technology is sufficient that we can get those tools.
Hey, Doctor, we, at this point, are in the middle of trying to deal with this, and no one knows whether we're going to be successful, and we hear that not everyone's taking it seriously, but then again, we have done a lot in the last week that maybe we thought was going to be impossible. There are 9,000 or so, there's probably more, deaths globally. Do you think that we could manage to mess this up so badly in the United States that we could eventually, and I'm not talking about in 10 years of this coronavirus, but near term, could we have 1 million deaths? Is that a reasonable prediction to make that could happen in this country right now? Would you make that prediction, or that it's possible if we don't handle it right?
No, I wouldn't make that prediction.
Is it irresponsible to make that prediction?
Well, there was an analysis out of Imperial College that looked at scenarios, and that was one of the scenarios. I think that we're going to, we've shown we have the political will to quell this epidemic, and I think we're going to do what it takes to make sure that those out of bounds scenarios don't come to pass. We're going to pay a price for it, but we're going to do it. I think we could get into the hundreds of thousands of infections. We could be the country with the most infections, but not millions.
No, I'm talking deaths. Deaths in the United States, 1 million deaths in the United States.
Right, and you'd need tens of millions of infections.
Which is possible to happen, but you don't think it's likely if we do the mitigation.
If we let it burn through our population completely unchecked, it would be possible. We're clearly not going to do that, and so we're going to certainly have tens of thousands of cases. We might get into the low hundreds of thousands of cases, but I think that we're going to have the political will to do what's necessary to keep this epidemic from becoming larger than that.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We appreciate it, and we'll speak to you as we like to, hopefully just about every day. Thanks.
Okay, meantime, we have some breaking news. Weekly jobless claims, these are the numbers that everybody cares about, hitting the tape right now. Rick Santelli and Steve Leisman join us. But Rick, we're going to go to you first. Rick.
Yes, 281,000. Now, that might not sound like a huge jump from 211, but let's put it in time perspective terms. This comps to the highest level since September 2017 when it was 300,000. So it is a big jump. Continuing claims are a week in arrears, so it's not showing up there yet. They're still showing 1.701 million. That follows just a whisker under 1.7 on the revision. But my guess is you're going to see those continuing claims numbers, of course, start to move higher as the initial claims start to stack up week to week. On Philly Fed, minus 12.7. Now, this is a March number, and it is a record drop because it was at 36.7, which means basically down to minus 12.7. That's just shy of a 50.50-point drop. We've never done that before. We still have leading indicators to go. The long end is definitely much more vibrant than the short end right now, so you want to pay particularly close attention to the yield curve. And we see rates overseas. You guys have been discussing it. You know, the ECB pulling out a bazooka. Christine Lagarde kind of reversing what she said earlier with regard to credit spreads against southern economies, trying to get some of those Italian and Spanish yields down. But, you know, the test tubes only take you so far. This is going to be a grand experiment and part two of really what started in the credit crisis. And, of course, we'll continue to monitor. Joe and the gang, back to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Rick Santelli.
We're going to pop over to Steve Leisman, though, for just a second. You know, as we're going from house to house and studio to studio. Steve, you there?
I am here, Andrew, and I'll just characterize this very quickly as those, you know, first dark clouds that come before the arrival of the full storm. This pop-up to 281,000 in jobless claims showed that a bunch of people, when this thing first hit, were laid off and were able to go and get to unemployment insurance claims. We have been doing some stories here on CNBC about some of the lines at some of the state offices, or difficulty in getting them. There aren't actually lines, they do it over, but just backups there. These are numbers that you had Ian Shepherdson on a couple hours ago saying they could get up to 2 million. And these could be very, very stark for at least several months or several weeks. And this will be a week that it'll be, these are from the prior week. This will be a week we'll start to get a lot of these numbers go on up. Some of the vulnerable sectors, 15 million employees in retail, 12 million in restaurants and bars. So you'll be looking to those sectors as the ones that will be the most vulnerable. And we'll see if the combination of the social safety net as it exists, unemployment insurance, and the one coming from the federal government is enough to tide people over to get back to work, hopefully in a couple months, Andrew.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Boeing stock losses have been stunning. Shares are down more than 60% since the start of March. I just looked at the market cap of Boeing, and obviously, when the B word gets thrown around, you wouldn't necessarily think that the market cap would be maintained. But you know, to see Boeing with a market cap of $57 billion and Netflix, you know, 2 or 3 times, that's unbelievable. They were down 18% just yesterday, and now the company says it needs big-time government support to maintain liquidity. Phil LeBeau has more on the talk of the bailout. Good morning again, Phil.
Hey, Joe, we're talking with Boeing executives as well as with people in Washington, D.C. I know Eamon and Kayla have been all over that in terms of where we are in that process. This is part of that Phase 3 package. You know, there's $150 billion that supposedly is going to be set aside for critical industries, companies in critical industries. We believe that the Boeing $60 billion request is part of that $150 billion. But until that finally is going through the process and we get more definitive answers, we won't know for sure. But that's the assumption at this point. Let's take a look at shares of Boeing and a couple of things to keep in mind. The primary focus for the company right now is getting that government aid secured. And remember, it's not just for Boeing, it would be for the entire aviation sector, because most of the money that would go to Boeing would then be passed on to suppliers to keep that supply chain intact, so it doesn't collapse in some fashion. And again, the ask at this point, $60 billion. Meanwhile, production continues at the Boeing plant in Everett, Washington, just outside of Seattle. Now, this is where they make the 777 as well as the 787 Dreamliner. I've had a number of people say to me, well, look, they've had some cases out there. As far as we know, they've had at least 6. Why haven't they shut down production? That is a call that's going to be reached in part by the local health officials, along with Boeing, along with the union. The union plays a role in this in terms of whether or not people say they want to work or not. A couple of quick notes. You got Hawaiian now saying that they're going to be cutting their capacity by 40%, and this morning, American taking out a fresh $1 billion line of credit, accessing liquidity now up to $8.4 billion in total liquidity available right now. Guys, back to you.
Hey, Phil, just a quick question for you. What we've heard from the automakers, the big 3 automakers, saying that they're going to be shutting down their plants for now, does that mean they're going to be next coming up with a bailout package of what they need?
I think their liquidity is in a little better shape, but this, now, Becky, you bring up a good question here in terms of how long these plants are shut down, because remember, that's what drives the cash flow generation for the automakers. It's not when you and I go to a dealership and we buy a vehicle. That's retail sales. That's not what impacts the automakers. What really impacts the automakers is when the dealers buy vehicles from the automakers, and they are essentially doing that as soon as they come off the line. So if they shut down for a week or 2, can they withstand that? Yes. Now, are they going to be shutting down production for 6 weeks, 7 weeks? Now you've got a completely different story.
Well, and then you get into the issue of the automakers, the auto dealers being in a position of, if nobody's coming in to buy cars for the next 6, 7, 8 weeks, are they going to be continuing to buy the cars from the manufacturers too? It's the cyclical situation.
Correct. So there is a little bit of good news here in that it doesn't back up the inventory anymore in terms of cranking out the vehicles and the dealers saying we don't want them. And just for a quick point of reference, guys, in terms of demand on the retail side, people going out to dealerships, J.D. Power fresh data that they reported to us yesterday, between Friday of last week and Sunday, the amount of retail sales went from negative 20% on Thursday and Friday down to negative 36% on Sunday. So clearly, people are pulling back and not buying new vehicles.
All right, Phil, thank you very much. All right, our next guest is a former top economic advisor to President Trump. Gary Cohn is joining us right now. He'd been talking about just a week ago that he thought the U.S. was in a recession, and that was before we even saw the crazy market moves that we've seen since then. Gary is the former director.
I think we've maybe lost Becky briefly, but Gary Cohn, I think, is still on the line with us. Gary, can you hear us?
Yeah, I am with you, Andrew. Sorry about losing Becky there.
We're going to get Becky back in just a second, and I will try to ask the questions that I imagine she may have. You lived through the financial crisis. You've also lived inside this administration. There are now so many different bailout packages on the table. How do you see these things playing out right now?
So, Andrew, look, I think it's important that we put this in perspective. You know, we've got a public health crisis, and the policy of Washington at this point is to focus on the economy and the economic recovery. So when I think Washington is talking about throwing money into the situation, which is the complete right answer and probably the only answer, I think they're looking at, and this is what they're trying to get right, is they're looking at trying to keep people employed. And how do we get people employed once this crisis is over? And how do we keep businesses intact so when the crisis is over, workers will have a job to go back to? As people are talking about, different forms of recovery, which brings back sort of haunting memories to me, whether it's U or V or L, part of that equation is going to be, do people actually have jobs to go back to? Do the industries or businesses that they were working to prior to this crisis, do they actually still exist? And I think Washington is very, very cognizant of that and try to make sure that those industries, those jobs exist. And what I'm mostly talking about is, half of the Americans that work in small businesses, whether they work in, restaurants or bars or movie theaters, or they drive an Uber or they drive a Lyft. We have to make sure that once we're clear to go back to work, that they have businesses to go back to.
Well, Gary, I think one of the things that people are looking at, though, is on one side, it appears that we're going to ultimately bail out, maybe in an idiosyncratic, I'm not going to say indiscriminate way, but there are going to be winners and losers chosen among big companies. I'm talking about airlines and the like, and so many other companies that are going to Washington asking for money right now. And then on the other end, we're hearing literally, I've been talking about it all morning. I was on the phone with so many CEOs yesterday who were literally in the process of laying off employees in the moment. And so the question is how we're going to get those employees back to work. Are they going to be employed retroactively? How does that even happen? And will there be enough demand on the other side if and when we get there? And of course, we will get there. Of course, the question is more when. How you make that all work and how you actually get the economy back up and running.
Yeah, look, Andrew, I agree that we're going to get there. It's just a matter of when. And what I hope Washington is avoiding, and I think they are, and I think that's why they've spent so much time on this phase 3 and they've broken it into buckets, is they have to avoid the squeaky wheel syndrome. They have to avoid the companies that are big enough and strong enough to go lobby the White House and Congress to get their bailout package. Companies maybe only employ, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people, where you look at half the economy being employed by very small businesses, a guy that owns a pizza shop or two, or a coffee shop or two, or an Uber driver. They are the ones that really are the backbone of the economy. The big businesses, in many respects, they're in better positions to keep their employees on, keep their employees intact, and make sure there's a job to come back to.
But there's a political social question we were talking with Ray Dalio about, which is to say that after the financial crisis, you lived it, you know it, and what happened to the perception of the banking industry as a result of that, which is to say people are going to say, if we're going to bail these guys out, we want something for it. They have either been irresponsible or did buybacks or this or that with their money and didn't have an insurance fund for this time. And then we're going to get into a question about nationalizing these things.
Yep.
How do you think that this should go?
I think we've got to talk about the workers first. There'll be plenty of time to discuss those political issues. But right now, we're talking about an environment where we saw, initial job claims go up by 70,000 last week. We're talking about an environment where the Treasury Secretary said potentially 20,000.
20% unemployment. Do you believe that? I mean, that's part of the Bill Ackman, we are going, hell is coming kind of thought process.
Look, I believe that we are going to have massive unemployment very, very quickly. And I hope that all of our predictions are wrong. But you cannot work today. Even if you want to go out and work, you are not allowed to work. If you're an Uber driver and you're out there trying to pick up fares, there's no fare to pick up. So you're literally trying to work. So in essence, you're de facto unemployed, not because you want to be unemployed. You're unemployed because there's no revenue opportunity for you. If you've got a restaurant that can't really operate in the delivery or pickup service, you're de facto being forced into unemployment. You're in the movie theater business. Think of all the service industries that we just think are part of our normal everyday life. I always remind people, we're an 80% service economy. Think of what your favorite city looked like 30 years ago and think of the retail stores that occupy today. Those retail stores are service stores. They're not goods stores. Our economy is based on buying services.
Hey, Gary, let me ask you, just in terms of how this is going out, the idea of a check to every American. I realize that this is happening very quickly. We need to get relief out there very quickly. But do you want to see something like that, or you want something much more targeted to help the people who are most impacted?
Look, Becky, we'd love to be more targeted. I would love to see more targeted to people that are unable to work and don't have the financial means. That would be the right answer. I just don't know if we have enough time to go through with the proper detail and get it to the right people. So if we're going to err on giving it to too many people or too few people, I'd rather give money to too many people at this point and make sure that we at least keep people in a position where they can feed their families and they can be in a position to help us recover the economy.
Some of your very specific ideas are making sure that landlords give, rent relief to the small businesses that are in them and that they get 3 months back, that some of the other people, make sure that that happens even for mortgage payments for people and for rent payments for individuals as well.
Yep.
You think that's likely to get done?
Well, it's going to get done. So, look, landlords are going to be in no position with courts closed. It's going to be impossible to evict or foreclose upon people. So tenants are basically going to be able to stay in their premise. What I was trying to do is I was trying to get people the ability to take that loss on their 2019 taxes, which have yet to be filed, which is stimulus to the economy. So instead of waiting till a year from now till you file your tax returns and take that business loss, take the loss in 2019, and when you file your return, you would get a bigger refund. Again, it's going to cost money, but it puts money back in the pockets of smaller landlords. You know, we all think about the big landlords. Think about the small landlord. Think about the person that owns a retail shop on the first floor and lives on the second floor, and they really use the income to live off of. You know, that person is losing their income, so give them the ability to file that lost income on their 2019 taxes so they can support themselves.
Gary, very quickly, these are a lot of great ideas. I wish you were still in the administration doing some of these things. Have you talked to anybody there?
So, look, I want to be as helpful as I can. I'm in touch with some of my former colleagues in the White House, and I continue to be helpful, and I continue to reach out.
Okay. Gary, I want to thank you for your time today, and we'll have you back soon to talk more about this, because obviously this is an evolving situation. Again, Gary
Thanks,
Cohn.
Becky.
Let's get to CNBC headquarters. Jim Cramer joins us now. Jim, with some of the best levels of the day in the Dow, we were just down 400 a half hour ago. We're down about 150 this morning right now. What do you think?
Well, first, I love Dr. Gottlieb, and I think that what Dr. Gottlieb was saying, I know that's widely quoted already, Joe, is the million deaths if worse come. Now, I understand where your question is coming from. You're basically saying, listen, it's obviously not going to be that. Should we actually be a little more, not sanguine, but more realist? And I think that was the point of your question. Tell me otherwise, because you know I talk with you every day, and what you were trying to say is this isn't going to happen, correct? Am I right?
I hope that we do the things that are necessary to prevent it from happening. I can certainly see how it would happen when you do it with simple math, Jim, but I'm hoping that, I mean, so many things are swirling around. I'm thinking maybe there's a lot more infections that we don't even know about because it's minor. I'm hoping the death rate isn't 1%. I'm hoping I wish it was 0.3 or 0.4%, Jim, but if it takes an entire year to work through and 100 million people get infected, then I mean, the number is there. I'm just trying. I don't want 1 million people to die, Jim.
Right. I mean, I think you're saying the denominator is going to be maybe, I don't know, 10, maybe 100 times what we have now. But the numerator may not be as dangerous. And I think look, that's not false hope. I think that's factual. Facts defeat fear. And yes, we're going to see the denominator, the number of people who are infected. Yeah, obviously, there's a big backlog. I mean, when we come in and if it's 200,000, we're going to have to be here and we're going to have to say, you know what, we're going to win. If it's 2 million, we're going to have to say we're going to win. Not because it is fanciful and not because it's too optimistic. It is what happens. There's very little faith in science this morning. I don't blame it. The scientists, yesterday the AbbVie drug didn't make it. But there's a lot. I think there should be more faith in science and less worry about the workers will be tied over. I'm convinced of that. But the idea that science is blind is certainly not the way it's been in history. I'm sure that most of us thought that we had a shot at getting polio who were born my year when we had to stay inside. There are people who were born, I had measles, mumps, chicken pox, all within about 7 months. I think people think that those are like rickets and smallpox. So I don't know. I'm just saying, don't be stationary and static when you look at the situation. And don't think out 4 weeks. Maybe you think out 4 months. Maybe you think out 4 years. I don't care. But if you look at the picture right now, it is really very much like, I don't know, when the Soviets and the Nazis signed their non-aggression pact. And we still haven't even gotten to December 7th yet of 41. I just urge people to be a little more historical and a little less frightened about what it currently looks like.
I guess I was doing the math too, Jim. If it's 9,000 total deaths and, it started in China, we have to be really pessimistic about our ability to replicate, if we can believe China, but to replicate. I've even been told China may not be completely honest with what's happening, but South Korea, if you look at the South Korean model, they've They've bent the curve to an extent. They've got 100 deaths or whatever it is.
Why did Starbucks reopen a store in Wuhan? In Ground Zero.
Right, if they're lying.
Why did they do that yesterday? Kevin Johnson spoke with him. He's the CEO. He announced this. They broke the news on Mad Money last night. I mean, there's a company that's deeply committed to its workers. They call them the partners. Why would they do that? If the Chinese were lying, Kevin would not open that store. He's already opened stores. 90% of the rest of the stores are open. Hormel said business as usual. Now you can say, well, wait a second, of course, spam. Business was usual in thermonuclear war for those guys. But I do think that it's worth noting that Starbucks is not the PRC and is truthful, not propaganda. Again, look, not false optimism, Joe. Just the idea of, like, let's just think a little bit further out. Because what happens if we say, you know what, we've picked all these winners, or the workers got fortunes, and then the FDA later today says, you know what, we really like the way the malaria trials work.
Right.
You know, then what do we do? Well, we spent a couple of weeks. No, it could be years, it could be months. I'm just saying to look at it statically is to believe revelations. And I'm not going with the pale rider and the pale horse.
Right. And that, you know, and we're so, you know, we're so unhealthy here, and we're so, you know, people are partying and not paying attention that somehow 9,000 global deaths, we're so, I don't know, not serious about this, that we have 1 million here. I just hope it doesn't happen, Jim.
Well, remember, there have been no people who died or under 30 in Italy.
Right,
that too. Matt, look, we're not trying to triage older people.
No,
maybe we quarantine. Look, Dr. Fauci, I understand he's going on Barstool today. Well, why is he doing that? Because the silent killers in the stadium here, the millennials who think that they live forever, I think that there's a great short story called Appointment in Samara by John O'Hara, and all the pessimists at hedge funds should go read it, because it's about you can't avoid the Grim Reaper.
All right.
I think the Grim Reaper can be avoided.
I hope so. Hope springs eternal. Jim, thanks. We'll check back with you. Joining us now for more on the markets, Jim Grant, founder and editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. Probably you don't have a molecular biology degree, I guess, Jim, but you sure know a lot about monetary policy. Where are we now in terms of central banks around the world and the ability to do more?
Well, we are at kitchen sink level, which reminds me, Joe, of something that happened 200 years ago, which is a famous raging panic in England in 1825, and in subsequent testimony, a director of the Bank of England said that seeing the dreadful condition of the public, we did all we could, and, quote, upon some occasions we were not over nice, meaning that they broke all the rules that in place. They lent against merchandise, for Pete's sake, not merely against commercial bills or exchequer bills. So I think that the impulse to meet a crisis like a lion, that is an age-old impulse with the central bankers, and that's what they're doing. What is different these days is that we have been meeting non-crises like lions. We have been, upon many occasions, not over nice in the preceding 10 years to this. So we go into the crisis, as it were, with a compromised corporate financial immune system, huge leverage, very low-quality debt, and very high equity valuations, with the result that the financial part of this panic, we have two panics, it seems to me. We have a hypochondriacal panic, and we have a financial panic. And the financial panic is aggravated by the events following 2009 and preceding February 2020.
Hypochondrial panic.
Well, we have an ascertainment panic. I mean, people are taking their temperature even more frequently than they're washing their hands. Imagine if CNBC and CNN and the rest of them reported every single ordinary case of influenza. I mean, I think that a friend of mine from years ago, a guy named Preston Carter, a Texas real estate operator, said that you look at cows in a pasture, and a candy wrapper blows in, and one starts running, and everybody starts running. Well, that, to a degree, describes the nature of panic in all creatures. And it seems to me that part of what we are dealing with is simple panic, abstracting entirely from proximate causes, from science, from finance. Oh, my goodness. You know, Jim, okay, you know, we've had hedge fund titans talk about the end of times. But it seems to me that what we are about, to a degree, is simple panic. I mean, what happens if there was an announcement with every single auto fatality? We Americans endure 40,000 auto fatalities a year, Jim, in the service of a functional economy.
Jim, so but what are you recommending? Because I think, look, it is a very uncomfortable conversation, which I think is happening privately, but nobody would happen in public, really. People are talking about trade-offs, and I don't want to necessarily have that conversation right now. But what are you suggesting behind what you're saying?
I'm not quite sure I get the question. I'll take it down to the microscopic level of a financial periodical called grants. What we are trying to do is to look for opportunities in chaos, mispricings. We looked at a Series F preferred
30 seconds,
mortgage.
Jim. 30 seconds. Sorry.
There are things for sale that you'd want to own.
Okay.
Period.
All right. Excellent. I'm sorry that we try to hit the next show straight up at 9 o'clock, and the world can be going insane, but that's something that we need to do, believe it or not. Thanks, Jim. We'll have you back. Andrew, I don't know where the heck you're going to be tomorrow, but I may be here again, and we'll see you somewhere. Becky, we'll see you there. CNBC special coverage continues right now.
Good Thursday morning. I'm Carl Quintanilla with Jim Cramer and David Faber, all coming to you live from separate locations, starting a little bit early, as the NYSE is set to switch to all electronic trading on Monday. Futures down, albeit in a relatively limited fashion this morning, as economists start trying to quantify the impact we are going to see in Q2. Jobless claims spike, as we expected, up 70K to 281. We'll get an 11 a.m. briefing at the White House, guys, and spring begins tonight at 11:49 p.m. Jim, what a range of commentary the last 24 hours, as you know, whether it's Ackman and Dalio on one side. Your point, though, is no Revelation 6.8. Why are we not believing in science? And you've been pretty consistent on that. Right. Well, I mean, what happens today if the FDA improves remdesivir? What happens if they do that? Do we then start thinking about, well, geez, how much pain it'll be if we print all these dollars? How about if remdesivir is approved and we say, you know what, I'm really worried about Boeing. Now, Boeing, obviously, I mentioned that because that's probably the front and center, but I'm looking at the FDA and not at the FED, and I think that a lot of people who came on this morning, oh, damn, Carl, I lived in my car and was not doing so well. And it's not all done in fair weather. I listened to a lot of really rich people, some of them crying yesterday, others today talking about the end of days. They're doing the revelations. They do the appointment in Samara. I don't know. I think the American worker's a little tougher. And I think if we get remdesivir, we get approval, I think we'll all say, well, geez, maybe this thing isn't going to last forever, and we can tide workers over, and we can help the public health workers. So I don't know. I don't really know. I have no information. Maybe it's not today that the FDA does anything, but I just feel like the notion that science is static and that the worker is going to go down and that the hedge funds, well, we should be shaking because maybe their fifth beach house has to go. I don't know. I don't like the tone of the pessimists. I don't like it. Right. No, don't come by my house. Yeah, we're going to try to talk to as many smart people as we know. We got, of course, Remedi and Mollenkopf this hour, but Cuomo, Governor Cuomo here in New York, David, had a good point yesterday where he basically said the episode is like this, and it goes from here to here. We don't know the duration, but we do know there is a beginning and an end, especially if Piper is right, that remdesivir could be approved soon. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that would obviously, as Jim says, yeah, that would be a real positive, as we know, because if you can ameliorate people's concern that if, in fact, you do get this, you are conceivably really threatened, that would be extremely helpful and perhaps also allow things to start to move back towards some sort of normalcy. Jim, what I continue to hear, I mean, you hear so many things, obviously, and it's throughout the day. I can only imagine what it's like for the two of you as well. So many people want some sign that would give them confidence, though, now in the financial markets. I mean, my sense over the last 24 to 48 hours, guys, the people I speak to certainly are a lot more fearful about the economy than they really are about the virus. And I don't mean to in any way imply that the virus is not serious and that we don't want to continue fighting it as best we can and stopping its spread. But I would say the concern for the economy now eclipses that for the virus. And they're looking for some signs of confidence from our government, from within the financial markets itself. So many different moving parts, Jim, at this point. Hard to know exactly even where to look or where to begin.
Geez, David, I'll tell you, I think that's a spot-on view. The conversation that I get is, okay, what happens if Boeing goes bankrupt? What happens if the banks can't be saved? What happens if they decide if they're too slow? I mean, this was front and center a couple of days ago, right? I mean, the Clorox and the gloves. And now it's like, okay, well, how many people are going to get laid off? We're focused on the 830 number. We see a spike. I want to look at it differently. I think it's really important that when you have a guy like Jim Grant, okay, Jim Grant, we know him as negative, but you also know him as a terrific guy, and he's a realist, right? He's starting to talk about things that actually could go right. When the guys who have been pessimistic and correct start saying, hey, listen, let's think about these other things, it opens my ears, David, to a different line, which is to say, okay, what happens when we get through this? Do we, when, and no one thinks it's been an if, or do we look at the companies that have the clean balance sheets that are the winners? I mean, is Walmart going to be the nation's retailer, okay? Or do we look at it like it's bread lines, and it doesn't matter because there'll never be demand again? So I don't know, David. I think you're absolutely right that the focus is on the economy, and also a belief that no matter what comes out of Washington, it's not enough. I look at 90 votes in the Senate to try to help something, and I come back and say that maybe the politicians are less clueless than we think.
Jim, you can see it at the bottom of our screen, but Ford, of course, you can see borrowing $15.4 billion to offset the production shutdown we learned about yesterday, suspending the dividend, pulling guidance for 2020. Darden, similar moves overnight, Jim. I guess the question is, there was a good chart this morning from Barry Ritholtz about the Dow peaking when deaths in China were already at 1,000.
Right.
And even after Apple's Q1 warning on revenue really didn't impact the markets for several days. And when you have B of A trying to quantify Q2 down 12,
right,
and JP Morgan down 14, and Alarian says that's absurd because what is the market's ability to sniff out the other side of all of this?
Well, look, I mean, I think, let's say we see up numbers sequentially for Starbucks in China, which we're going to, as Kevin Johnson said last night on Mad Money, as they open a store in Wuhan, which is ground zero for this epidemic. Let's say if Apple's sequential numbers are better in China because they can reopen the Apple stores. Let's say if the government prevails upon Disney and they open up Shanghai Disney. That's not yet going to happen. I think we're going to say, you know what, here's what the other side looks like. It's not great. But it's not historically bad. You want some irony? I think there's a lot of irony. David's a believer in irony. Ford suspends its dividend, but we have a Morgan Stanley upgrade of Tesla. Why? Because Tesla has the wherewithal and the balance sheet to win. So again, I just say, you know what? We gotta think really big and creative, because that is almost, if I told you 3 months ago that Ford would be good because they survived the Great Recession and Tesla was obviously was going to go under, that was what the narrative was, and it switched. So you know what, we have to think bigger than what we see on our screens, because that was just inconceivable, Carl, that Ford would be the one on the ropes, the one that survived the Great Recession, and that Tesla comes out on top as the one with great liquidity. The problem of being with all
good
three.
point, Phil. I mean, good point, Jim. I don't know if you noticed Elon Musk overnight suggesting on Twitter that he could start making ventilators if the shortage were acute
Is there anything
enough.
that guy can't
Let's get
do?
to Phil LeBeau.
I mean, I'm waiting for him to come up with this. He probably has a solution. He's just holding out for a little drama. Probably has somehow that he knows how to cure. What a guy.
Let's get to Phil LeBeau for more on the Ford news. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Carl, you guys hit on this a little bit. Let me give you a little more clarity in terms of what Ford is announcing today. It is suspending its dividend of 15 cents a share. Not a surprise. I think a number of people have looked at Ford, General Motors, some of the major manufacturers. This question is coming up with Boeing. Will Boeing ultimately suspend its dividend, given the fact that all of these companies are facing tighter liquidity? It is also pulling its guidance for the rest of this year. We've seen a real slowdown in retail sales, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then also, they're going to be accessing up to $15.4 billion from 2 credit lines. They've got about $35 billion in liquidity at the end of 2019. Now, we don't have an updated number, but $35 billion at the end of 2019. They've got near-term liquidity Okay, it's not a problem. But keep in mind, guys, when you shut down production at an auto plant, which all of the automakers, the big three, have decided they're going to be doing effective either today or tomorrow, or they're in some cases phasing it in over the next couple of days, that's the cash flow that gets cut off immediately, because automakers, they get paid by the dealer. So as soon as a car comes off the line and it goes out the door, that's money coming back into the company. So guys, one last point regarding retail sales. Ford is also going to be offering customers 6-month payment relief for new car purchases. I bet you we see this from other automakers as well, because according to J.D. Power, guys, retail sales on Sunday dropped 36% compared to the same time last year, and it was down just 20% at the end of last week. I think we're going to see, David, big drop off in retail sales.
We would imagine, we can only imagine, Phil, that would be the case, of course. Hard to see how many people are going to actually be going to the dealership to buy a new automobile at this point. Phil, thank you. Phil, I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot of course, continuing to cover not just the autos, but more importantly, perhaps, what is going on with Boeing. But for now, let's detour and bring in Ginny Rometty. Still, by the way, the CEO and president of IBM, although not for much longer, but of course will remain as the company's executive chairman. Ginny, these are extraordinarily unusual times. I could not really ever imagine thinking that I would be bringing you in by sitting here in my dining area, but that's where we are right now. What is going on at IBM? And let me just specifically start, if I can, with the virus itself and the capabilities you have in terms of supercomputers and Watson. What are you doing that perhaps is advancing the ability of scientists to actually figure out how?
Yes, okay, so let me break that into pieces. And what are we doing? So, because I really believe private sector is going to play a huge part.
To 2 quarters, and then hopefully life can somewhat normalize and economies can somewhat normalize beyond that. That will take that from being the risk of a solvency crisis and put it more squarely in the space of a liquidity problem, and that central banks are in a position to, I think, solve with very aggressive actions. But again, this is really on the fiscal policymakers to fill in that income hole.
I think we can do that, and I hope we can do that very soon. Mike, great to get your thoughts on the programme. Mike Powell there of BlackRock. I'd like to get back to that breaking news on Ford. Let's do that and cross over to Bloomberg's Kelly Lights. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, John. Well, of course, Ford just moments ago withdrawing its guidance and suspending its dividend because of the impact of the coronavirus. I'm looking at shares in pre-market trading now down almost 8.5%. In addition to that, Ford has drawn from 2 credit lines. It has added about $15.4 billion to cash on its balance sheet. But again, suspending that dividend, withdrawing that guidance, as we've seen many companies do as they contend with the unknown factor that is this virus, John.
Provide any guidance in an environment like this. Kelly Light, thank you very much. South Africa cutting rates by 100 basis points to 5.25 from 6.25. Let's get the latest, shall we, from Chad Morganland of Washington Crossing Advisors portfolio manager. Chad, the companies are finally just saying we can't predict the future. The policymakers are coming in big time on both fiscal and monetary policy. What do you do in an environment like this, Chad?
So, John, as you know, we've been quite, guarded based off of valuations. As the market becomes disorderly, the credit market as well, we have now started to lean into risk. We are still looking for the highest quality companies that are consistently growing, that have very little debt on their balance sheet, and are well diversified from a product line perspective and a client-based perspective.
Where are you leaning in then specifically, Chad?
So we're going into consumer staples. We're also going into some selected industrials, healthcare across the board, valuations, again, have immediately compressed. Now, with that said, we believe that the tail of this is going to be somewhat more extended than potentially what the overall market thinks. So we're not going to get back to business as usual for the next 3 months. But with policy backdrop and monetary and fiscal policy across the globe, we think that will help soften the blow.
Jad, there's a word you used, and it was valuation. And obviously a lot of people are thinking about valuations, but I'm just wondering how on earth you have any kind of valuation in a market like this when the E is totally unknown for not just the next couple of quarters, but for the next year.
Yeah, John, you're 100% correct. For the next year or the next couple of quarters, things are going to get, or earnings on the S&P as across the globe is going to get marked down drastically. But you are buying an individual company that you're looking 3 to 5 years out on what their earnings potential could be. If you believe, which we believe, that this is not a permanent scenario and that over the course of the next 2 to 3 years we'll get back to a more normalized growth rate, then you have very good quality companies that are marked down 30 or 40% from just about a couple of months ago. So one has to be more patient. They have to have the intestinal fortitude to start to slowly lean into risk. And that's what we're doing at Washington Crossing Advisors at this point.
Hey, Chad, great to catch up. My best to you and the team. Chad Morganlander there of Washington Crossing Advisors. Coming up on this programme, the US dollar continuing to rally. Standard Chartered's Stephen Englander joining us to discuss the rush into the greenback. That's coming up next. And later, a conversation with Nuria Rabini, CEO of Rabini Macro Associates. In the markets right now, your cross-asset picture taking shape as follows. Around about 16 minutes away from the opening bell in New York, with futures down by 1% on the S&P 500, a very mild move lower relative to the very volatile price action of the last week or so and beyond. From New York this morning, sticking with you right here on Bloomberg TV, this is Bloomberg.
clients do want to go to cash. They feel that nothing is as safe as cash. And again, with the massive gyrations in the US dollar, even within cash, there is a clear preference for the US dollar right now above any other currency. So there is definitely a big retreat to the safest of safe haven cash liquidity at a time like this.
BNP Paribas' Edmund Shing on the US dollar rally. The Bloomberg Dollar Index now at record highs, the highest level since 2005, going all the way back to when that index began trading. Taking a look at the broader dollar rally, Bloomberg's Taylor Riggs. And Taylor, I've used this word a lot over the last couple of weeks, but for the US dollar specifically, it has ripped through this market in a brutal fashion.
You are 100% right. Record strength here on the Bloomberg Dollar Index, now surpassing the highs that we briefly saw after Trump was elected, given some of the inflationary fiscal stimulus at that time. So really, Jay Powell confirming that the dollar is the reserve currency of them all. Also confirming that monetary easing doesn't always translate into dollar weakness. Dollar strength, unfortunately, means a massive EM weakness. You have those FX markets now the lowest going back in about 3 years. Worst performers in the month, Mexican peso, Russian ruble, and the Brazilian real. It also means that there are some other weakness as we go over into the G10 space. Commodity pressured currencies, thinking Canadian and Aussie dollar, are weaker. Norway's central bank coming out today saying that they will intervene in the currency markets after the krone saw a historic slump against the dollar. And then, of course, your pound sliding to its weakest since 1985 after FX liquidity vanishing, John.
I'm disowning that pound right now. Taylor Riggs, thank you very much. I never thought it'd get down to those levels this quickly. Some fantastic input coming from our viewers and our audience worldwide, including our Bloomberg Terminal subscribers. At times like this, really stressful for you all, I know, but I think it brings everyone together in a magnificent way. Some real camaraderie that I'm experiencing, not just in Wall Street, but worldwide on trading desks across not just this country, but beyond, in Europe and Asia too. And the comments and suggestions you're picking across to me are absolutely brilliant. So please, I encourage you, keep doing it. And I'll try and involve many of them in my conversations with guests through this program and beyond. One particular question coming in right now is the move up in the dollar a confirmation of risk aversion more broadly, or a liquidity strain? Let's get to Steve Englander, shall we? Standard Chartered Head of Global FX Research, and ask him that. So, Steve, I'll repeat that question to you. The move in the dollar that we've seen, confirmation of risk aversion and or liquidity strain?
Look, it's both. I'd say that initially, say we went back to the early stages of this when the dollar was rising, and there was what you would call an orderly asset market fall. It was risk aversion. I think at this stage, it's the liquidity stage that's driving the risk aversion. So it's actually the two are actually the same. That market participants are looking at the demand for dollar assets and saying, and basically that's leading them to sell whatever they can, whatever is still liquid, in order to get those dollar assets. So I wouldn't make too much of a distinction. I would say that if we solve the liquidity problem, some of this risk-off problem would be solved. It wouldn't be all of it, because there's still an economic dimension in the background, but the money market dimension would be much easier.
So, Steve, let me ask you something that I think is incredibly difficult to do, perhaps even impossible. But let's pick a currency pair. Let's take cable, the pound against the US dollar. Over the last 4 years, since the Brexit vote, a break of 120, there's been support there. And quite clearly, there are no levels of support at the moment in an environment like the one we're in. We took out, I think it was 118.40 there and thereabouts, which was the flash crash low of October 2016. Knife through butter, 118, 17, 16, 15, 114 handle. Steve, 2 Mondays ago, we had a 132 handle. Let's say that these central banks can address this liquidity issue. You get back to fundamentals, and I'm trying to understand how much of this move lower in something like, say, cable was fundamentals, and how much was it just a freezing up of liquidity and a massive hunger for the US dollar? And if we address one issue, where does that currency pair go back to?
I think that in risk-off episodes, currencies tend to move more quickly to the downside than they recover when the risk-off is gone. But I think that the sterling would recover a large part of what it lost. There's still some issues with respect to the Brexit deal, but those are very secondary. If you look at the last 7 or 8 big figures, I'd say it's all market risk perception. I think there is an issue there that you alluded to that's really important. That one of the question marks is how each country is able to deal with the economic consequences of the virus, in the sense that we know that there's going to be a big hit. Most people, or many people, are working from home. Normal activity
back into the business, as Jim said, to now grow a $22 billion cloud business. I had to do that for those reasons and to build so that IBM will be here for the next century. So I think that will become very vivid to people about the priority and the order of where they put their capital.
Ginny, certainly appreciate your coming on during these trying times. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Ginny Rometty, of course, Chairman, and President, and CEO of IBM. That transition will take place in the CEO role. I believe it's April 8th. Ginny Rometty, back to you, Carl.
Thank you.
All right, David, thank you. And another eventful overnight for the Fed, this time regarding money markets. And I think Steve Leisman has some additional news this morning. Morning, Steve.
Yeah, Carl, another hour of additional Fed news of what they're doing here. You can't say they haven't moved fast. I want to report this morning, the Federal Reserve increasing the purchases that it's doing. These are the outright purchases. Remember that $700 billion program we told you about? Well, it did 40 and it did 40. Now it's up that almost double to $75 billion. That's across a range of tenors in the Treasury market and in the agency-backed mortgage market. I guess that's a sign that they feel like they need to come in and take more of that paper out. That's just one of the things it did this morning. At 9 o'clock, it announced that it increased the number of swap lines out there, dollar swap lines with foreign banks, added 9 central banks, so now there are 14 total. It's about the number, I believe it's the same number as we had in the financial crisis. So now this is an ability to solve the dollar funding problem throughout the world. And of course, that comes on the heels of 11:30 last night. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury announced a major backstop for money market funds. So it is true, Carl, another hour, another Fed action here. We don't know if they have all the pieces in place just yet to really put the backstop on trade in the economy or in the financial system. Sure, asset prices will decline. The Fed's interest here is making sure they decline in an orderly way and that there's liquidity to get from here to there. Carl?
I'll take it, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Steve Leisman, of course, with the latest on those Fed moves. Let's get to a mad dash. Haven't done this in a while. I'm accustomed to doing it sort of cross-country, Jim, when you're either in San Francisco, as you typically have done every quarter or so. Now we're just, well, I'm in Connecticut. You're in New Jersey. I miss you, actually. I wish I was there so we could sort of have our usual time together. McCormick is what you want to focus on for the Mad Dash. Let's take it away.
Yeah, I miss you and Carl. This thing, the separation, they forget. Morally, it just feels awful. Physically, obviously, we have to do it. You know what? There's a downgrade today from B of A, and I think it's kind of emblematic of what I'm concerned about, which is McCormick. They expect slower global food service demand, downgrade to underperform. We keep seeing, and the reason I say this is because we keep seeing these staples that everybody likes so much have some sort of hair on them. Yesterday, downgraded Coca-Cola. Turns out that they're bottlers that may be starved for capital. This is it. Remember, McCormick has a substantial food business, food service business, and those have been not so great. Look at Aramark. It's a shame because otherwise, I know I had Hormel on last night, and wow, they're killing it with Spam. I know, David, that your wife's not a big fan, but we subsist on anything at our place. And this piece, otherwise, Frank's and French's and spices, we're in a stay-at-home economy. So I'm going to go against this McCormick piece. I know it was up really big yesterday, but the stay-at-home economy is gigantic. And whether it be Zoom or whether it be Hormel, we're hunkering down. And, you know, David, you're maybe hunkering down in Connecticut. I'm going to be going solo in New Jersey, hunkering down big time with rice and beans.
Yeah, Jim,
Right,
it is a good point. Jim, today Credit Suisse takes Clorox to neutral on valuation to a large degree. But I loved your Hormel interview last night, and there's reports today about closing the border with Canada, the degree to which that may impact shipments of agricultural goods, which obviously is a big part of the food supply chain. How much risk do you see in there?
One of the things that Hormel talked to me about was of the chains that are out there, whether it be the supply chain for auto or the supply chain for aerospace, the strongest is the supply chain for food. Hormel was just saying, listen, it's actually working. So I know that we have a perfect storm of negativity, whether it be oil, whether it be airlines, whether it be obviously the healthcare, ventilators, I don't know, remdesivir's maybe not being approved. But the one thing that seems to be holding up well is the actual food chain. It's working. And so I guess I could say it could be worse. and we don't experience the lockdown like my daughter, who's an English teacher in Madrid, where they have, they're allowed to use real blunt force if you leave your place. It's almost China-like. So, I think that we have grocery stores, we got food. I mean, it could be worse.
NASDAQ futures go green, Jim, as you're talking. Some of the technicians that are looking at charts this week say, look, we don't care if they're looking for signs of health.
Right.
You don't want to see large moves down or large moves up. And so I wonder if you are taking some comfort in what looks appear today, obviously early, tepid signs of lessening volatility.
Well, that's fine. I mean, at 3:30 a.m. we had kind of a mini bull market in the futures, and then they got hit really hard at 4:45. Went negative at 5:40, then came all the way back. And all I can say is the knuckleheads and morons who are, Jimmy Chill, the people who are ill-advised in trading those things truly are just having some. Why don't they just go play some gin rummy or something? It would be more valuable. The S&P oscillator, which I follow from 1985, had the strongest negative reading, meaning the most oversold, actually exceeding the crash of 1987. And I think that's important because it was a sucker's game to short 1987. Now, look, we don't get anything from the FDA today, and Boeing suddenly files bankruptcy. Well, we'll take out that, too, and those are just conjectures. But I do think that what we want is not a big snapback, because that's going to be like the other one that we had the other day. That was up big, and that was a sucker's rally. We need to see some stabilization. We need to see the VIX go down. But, when you look at the averages yesterday, they're completely lying. If you look at the REITs, it basically said that those guys are probably going to go under. If you look at the retailers, you see some prices that you can't really look at. The restaurants, we looked at Darden last night and Eaton last night, and Eat. They look like they're bankrupt. And you know what? All I'm saying is that if buy companies that have good balance sheets, you actually might do well here.
Yeah. Jim, let's get the bell here at the NYSE, where, again, they'll go all electronic starting Monday. We got a bit of a head start on that just so we can get our operations and logistics down. That's Chris Taylor, Vice President of NYSE Listings at the NASDAQ. It is Bob McCooey, the Global Head of Capital Markets. And, Jim, a really quick shout-out here as Brett fills in to all of the IT managers and the HR managers around corporate America and small business. To the degree you can work from home, it is a bit of a small miracle of what we are able to do as a country. And imagine if this crisis had hit without this capability.
Oh, boy, I have Verizon on tonight just to talk about whether that the system that did not get overloaded. I know David's very focused on 5G. The IT people, unbelievable. Hey, how about the public health people? They're just out there right now. We know that they're going to be 10 times the number of people who are infected because we're way behind. And those people, I mean, I come to work in a suit. Oh, David with no tie. But we, come to desk. I mean, those people, they ain't just playing with Clorox. So let's have a shout out to them, too.
Guys, as the market opens here, of course, every day is its own singular event, it seems. I mean, yesterday, so many people calling to talk about dislocations in so many different asset classes. We saw yields back up, of course, in the government. We saw that incredible fall in oil prices yesterday. A bit of a rebound, at least the last I had looked. But that, in and of itself, its own incredible story at this point. A lot of talk, of course, about mass forced liquidity events at various funds that you might imagine is true, although there's also so much room for rumor in a market like this. Those that are running these risk parity strategies, big hedge fund complexes, people concerned about funding stresses there. Unclear how much, again, is true or not. But, Jim, during the course of one day, we can go through what feels like the events that would typically take place, well, in a month, if not even a longer period of time, given the moves, the volatility, of course, that you and Carl were just talking about.
Well, David, what that brings to mind is something you know better than anyone else in the country. I remember, because from the hedge fund days when you made the unfortunate calls. What it says to me is that there's some people who are not in control of their capital. They're either having redemptions or having margin calls because the moves are so accentuated. I can't believe it's just people saying, you know what, I don't want to own Brinker at 8. I really want to get rid of Southwest Air. Are there some people who are motivated not by value, but by someone from the margin department who's saying, get that money in by 2 o'clock or you're gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely an element of that going on in various markets. There's got to be, and we've got to stay focused on sort of these larger questions, too, in terms of some of the, the banks that are obviously there to some extent for players in the financial markets, those that are huge commodity traders in the oil markets globally. And then you get back to things like the airlines and the bailout that we assume is going to take place in the not too distant future, one would expect. I know the government was out signing up legal counsel very recently to represent it in what would obviously be a fairly complex structure. And then, guys, there's the bigger question, Jim, which we haven't talked about today, which is what are Mnuchin and company going to do here in terms of getting money into the hands of employees out there? You know, Jim, you were talking about this a lot during yesterday's show, and it's not as though it's gone away. In fact, it's only picked up steam. Many different people coming forward with potential plans. I'm hearing about them during the course of the day. People trying to get them into Secretary Mnuchin's hands in terms of maybe this is the better way to go or that's the better way to go. One that I'd love you to chime in on, because I've talked to a number of leaders in the financial services community about this who sort of seem at least to coalesce around the basic idea, is as follows. That you would refinance the first lien and some second lien loans and bonds on the balance sheets of companies, not necessarily your biggest companies, but many of the ones that we know about that have those frontline employees who are going to lose their jobs. The employment loan would come from the government. It might replace the banks, or perhaps it would backstop the banks. It depends. And it would be equal to about 50% of the compensation deduction that the company took on its 18 returns. You could have an interest rate of 5 to 8%, but it could pay in kind for the first 2 years, mature in 5 to 7 years. The idea is get at the very top of the capital structure, replace the banks or augment the banks, and get the money to the employees. Jim, I know you're hearing a lot of these plans. I know you're talking to people as well who are in a position to actually implement some of these plans. When are we going to get something that happens here? Because every hour matters.
I know. I mean, I just was going back and forth with the Treasury Secretary, and they come up still with, the president's determined to support the U.S. economy, and there are many great U.S. companies that will merge strong. I mean, we're still getting what I regard as a very high level, I hesitate to use the word platitude, but yeah, what you revealed is very good for companies that are solvent. But I care far more, put my other hat on, about small and medium-sized business. And every time I cringe when I hear that, we're going to make loans available. That's all you need, is to have a business that can't do business, that's told to close, where you then layer on debt. So when you open, you close again because you can't afford the debt. I like your plan for the solvent companies. It doesn't do much for the companies that are insolvent immediately because the government has demanded them to be insolvent.
Right, but Jim, I mean, we know in 6 months or some period of time we're going to be out of this, and they're going to be in a position to actually have their business operating again.
No,
I mean, you can infuse capital to those companies to let them actually operate.
Boeing is down
the government steps into the top of the liability stack. Yeah.
Boeing is down the most in the Dow. If what you heard, and boy, that would be terrific, if that came out and was said it's available to Greg Smith, the CFO of Boeing, then I think that Boeing would not be the stock that would weigh on the Dow. If the president were to call Saudi Arabia and say, all right, guys, hey, you know what, terrific, you wiped out half of our industry, but we're going to remain energy independent because we want to be independent of you, because when you're overrun by the bad guys, we're not going to be there. You get oil back to 28.30, then we able to preserve the Permian. There's some things the government can do. It's maybe 5 calls. It could be done by 11. FDA comes in and does remdesivir, the Gilead drug. And what we're going to say is, why did we decide that 10 million workers had to be thrown out? So I like the plan. It needs to be put in action, especially when we need to refinance in the first lien and extend any maturity. But that has to go to like Boeing's 2 million people. Please do not think that we're trying to rescue the CEOs. Let them get no pay. No pay. Do it Mark Cuban.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a good point, Jim, and it reminds me of what Marriott has said this morning on their conference call, suspending Ernie Sorensen's salary for the balance of the year, reducing salaries for senior executives by half, temporary leaves in North America, cutting work weeks around the world, and a pullback on essential spending. I wonder, Jim, what your take was on these reports that Kudlow floated, the government taking equity stakes in companies that need massive aid, Schumer requiring a commitment to lay off no employees as opposed to 90%, which was Sorkin's idea earlier in the week.
Well, look, I like anything that protects the workers. I think that the big problem, when you go back and look, what was the punishment from Dodd-Frank for the investments in the banks, which actually made money, by the way. The Federal Reserve made money for the Treasury. What was the punishment was, you know what, we can't keep doing this because the CEOs made out like bandits. So what we have to do is just look at the proxy, see who the highest paid people are, and tell them, look, you can get this first lien, but you know what? That money, your salary, is going to go to the workers. Now, I know that that's going to sound a little too much like what is to be done, Lenin's seminal treatise about what we should do with corporations, but I don't think any of us care. I think at this point, we cannot have the fat cats make money at the expense of the workers. Now, I have to ask you guys, will there be a fifth home hedge fund provision? Because we've had a couple of hedge funds on this morning who, behold, there is a pale horse yesterday, too. And, you know, it's shaking because I think I don't want class warfare in this country. And the way you get class warfare in this country is to have billionaires tell us, look out, it's the end of days. We got to be a little more focused. What do you guys think of that?
Are you referring directly to Ackman?
Oh, come on. No picking on people. This is Jimmy Chill.
Yeah, I mean, look, Jimmy was, he had our air for 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, it's all right. You know what? It's programming.
It was suboptimal, I think.
It was suboptimal, and I would say ill-advised along with suboptimal. But you know what? Yeah. Everyone's entitled to opinion. We've got that view. We learned that early on when we were in 5th grade.
They are. You want to try to keep emotion out of it as best you can. I will say, Carl, you know, on this side. Yeah, on this idea of the government taking stakes that I guess Kudlow brought up, I mean, in part, that was done, you know, there was a great deal of moral hazard that was obviously brought on by the banks, and the idea perhaps as a government would be in there as a significant shareholder to balance that. I'm not hearing that on this time. I mean, most of these companies, other than buy back stock perhaps over the years instead of using the capital in a different way, though it's not clear to me that they wouldn't have been pressured to use their capital, so it's not clear that they would have had oodles of cash sitting around. But nonetheless, they did not do anything here that is bringing this on. This is not deserved in some way. This is an unexpected event that has overtaken so many companies at this point. I'm not hearing a desire on the part of many that the government take a stake, in part because it's going to have the effect of depressing stock prices even further, perhaps, because of the dilution that would take place. I think, again, better to have the government come in and backstop the banks or replace the banks at the very top of the stack in some fashion for companies that need the aid, as opposed to taking equity stakes.
Yeah, David's right. I mean, I looked at the equity stake idea and have the option of doing that if you're the CEO. But of course, obviously, no more buyback and no more payment. No more CEO payment during this period. That's what distinguished, what did the bankers do wrong during the other days? I mean, they said, listen, we were making $10 million this year, and you know what, we're not going to make as much as $10 million. No, they got to take that away. But I think you're right, David. I'm precipitous in saying equity stake, unless a company says we want the equity stake, which is no different from, and we'll put someone on the board. So I think that you're cool-headed on this and very factual.
All right, guys, let's check in with Bob Pisani, who would normally be on the floor, but we're all trying to work out our future teamwork and logistics, and he's joining us remotely as well. Morning, Bob.
And who would have thought that I'd be here at my home rather than down on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange? You know, the New York Stock Exchange floor closing is really a microcosm of what's going on around the country. The NYSE is essentially like a giant mall that's got restaurants and stores in it, and the restaurants and stores are essentially the floor brokers and the designated market makers that are out there. So you can say we're going to close it and reopen this giant mall 2 months from now, but the question is, are all the restaurants and all the shops going to be able to efficiently open 2 months from now? And that was one of the concerns that existed about closing the NYSE. And of course, they did make the right decision as soon as there were any positive coronavirus cases. Let's look at the sectors this morning here. A little bit of bifurcation, but not dramatic here. Healthcare, consumer staples, also down, not as much as banks and industrials. Energy was briefly positive, and once again, they press it. They have just been pressing any rally in energy for the last several weeks. I want to show the broader markets, which caused so much distress yesterday to traders. Most traders, I have on top, the first thing I have is the S&P 500. 100. The second thing that I have is the bond market, LQD, and that was a little weaker yesterday, continues to be weak today. Oil up, 18-year low up today, but down big yesterday. Gold fractionally on the upside as well. So that's not as bad as it was today, but there was a lot of distress when everything was down dramatically. At least today, oil, you see, is on the upside here. They were talking about Mr. Kudlow and talking about maybe buying equity stakes. This has got Wall Street in a tizzy. People are remembering what happened with some of the bailouts where the equity got wiped out, and so it's a problem. Boeing's down another 9% today. The airlines are still having problems here, and I think this is a real overhang. So they've got to clarify this. Are we just talking about government loans, 20 billion, 40 billion, whatever to Boeing? Or are we talking about loans that convert to equity in some way? If it's a loan to convert to equity, Wall Street's going to have a very, very different viewpoint because of what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. I want to remind people about where we are right now, and we keep saying, well, the S&P is 30% off its highs, and it is, but you want to look at the broader market. While most everything else is roughly around there in the major indices, the Russell has gotten clobbered, and I don't think we've been emphasizing that up. The Russell 2000 down 42% from its high. So it's suffered. Small caps here in the United States, small businesses have suffered much more than the larger businesses. I think that's a key point here. Finally, a little shout out to Nick Colas over at DataTrek, who pointed out some of the disparities in the way these indexes are constructed. They are market cap weighted indexes. The S&P Tech Index is only 18% off its high. But remember, the S&P Tech Index is 41% Microsoft and Apple, 21% Microsoft, 20% Apple. So essentially, because Microsoft and Apple aren't down as much, Microsoft's only down 11, Apple's down 16, the rest of the stocks in this, which are the majority, of course, are really suffering. They're down a lot more. So Micron's down 35, IBM, you just had Gene on, 23%, and Lam Research, all of the semiconductors down a lot more. So this goes back to what I call the politics of index construction. You got to know what's in them. And of course, Carl, there's a lot of these ETFs out there that don't weight these companies by market cap. They weight them by other factors, equal weight. Some of them weighted by quality. Some of them weight them by earnings. And maybe that's another way to look at that, because obviously you're going to get a very different result here if you weight them other than market capitalization. Carl, back to you.
All right, Bob. Talk to you in a bit, Bob Pisani. Dow down about 3%. Let's check in with Rick Santelli this morning as well. Hey, Rick.
Hi, Carl. Boy, there's just so much volatility going on, and it certainly seems as though some of these negative rates and low rates around the world are getting a whole lot more positive. Let's look at a week to date of 10-year note yields and realize we at least peaked so far at 127 yesterday. Intraday, that was right about an hour before the stocks closed, and of course it tapered off a bit. Here we now hover right around 112, so we're down a little bit, settled basically around 117, 118. Let's look at what's going on with regard to other paper across the globe. Let's look at what's going on in Italy, for example. The Italian 10s, unbelievable volatility. Boons, unbelievable volatility. Matter of fact, Boons right now are hovering at some of the best levels that we have seen. It is unbelievable. It's now on the sunny side of minus 20. Okay, and Italian rates, which were at 3% yesterday, around 182 today. And you look at Swiss, the Swiss 10-year, it was at minus 100 last week. Now it's at minus 24. These are big moves. And actually, in a perverse sort of way, it will make recalibration of all global rates better. You know, remember, we have not really normalized on the rate structures, economy to economy, large developed economies, European, Japanese, U.S., Chinese, since the credit crisis. And this is not necessarily a good thing, but it's going to put everybody on a much closer footing. Maybe the dark side is we haven't really seen Europe or Japan heal from some of this. We heard Jim Grant talking with Joe Kernan this morning about that exact topic. When it comes to foreign exchange, though, nobody's beating what's going on in the dollar. Here's a chart going back to early 2017 of the dollar index, which right now, should it close, be at the best levels basically in 3 years, March of 2017. It is just so aggressive. It is really showing us in real time this unbelievable, insatiable demand for dollars, and it's not necessarily a good thing. Once again, I still say the amount of time we're going to spend over 100 isn't going to be long. But that doesn't mean we won't get up to 104, 105, 106. But it will moderate, and when it moderates, most likely that will coordinate with some global reprieves with regard to equity prices. David, back to you.
Okay, Rick, thank you, Rick Santelli. Take a look at shares of Qualcomm. This morning, the stock is down. Of course, like so many others, it is down roughly 32% or so over the last 3 months. But it is still up about 5% over the last year. Joining us now is the company's chairman and CEO, Stephen Molikoff, who is joined...
16 minutes into the session, here's your equity market in New York City. We are lower by 2.72% on the S&P 500, off on the Nasdaq by 1.4%. On the Dow, we roll over by 3 percentage points. Let's lift the lid and get you some sector price action and bring in Bloomberg's Taylor Riggs. Hey, Taylor.
John, every sector on my screen right now firmly in the red, and the very economically sensitive sectors leading those declines: industrials, utilities, real estate. Morgan Stanley coming out with a note worried about some of the mortgage bonds as perhaps the plumbing isn't working as well. Financials also 4.8%, struggling to digest some of the monetary easing rules. I want to flip up the board and take a look at the individual stocks, perhaps in the restaurant industry. One in particular stock I'm looking at, Darden Restaurants, plunging after the company said the CEO is looking at staff levels. He will go without a salary. They're limiting in-store diners, reducing menu options, planning to reduce advertising and more. This poor restaurant industry really struggling to look at the fallout of what could be a big hit to their sector. John.
Taylor Riggs, thank you very much. Let's turn to Nouriel Roubini now, chairman and CEO of Roubini Macro Associates, warning of a global recession, writing that his base case is that the coronavirus pandemic is not contained until the third quarter, writing, quote, the global economy experiences a formal recession rather than a rolling recession. China and emerging markets experience a growth collapse that is effectively a recession, and global growth is close to 0%. I'm pleased to say that Nouriel joins us on the phone right now. Nouriel, great to have you with us. Let's just draw a distinction between what you've called a rolling recession and a formal recession. What's the difference there, Nouriel?
Well, initially, market thought that there'll be a recession in the first quarter only in China, Japan, Korea, and maybe Italy. And then by the second quarter, we'll have a recession in U.S. and Europe. And by the third quarter, we'll be growing everywhere around the world. That will be a rolling recession. To have a technical recession, you need to have at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. But if you look at the United States, based on the retail numbers, even just for February, let alone the collapse in March, we're going to have negative growth already in the first quarter in the United States. In the second quarter, even J.P. Morgan says that output and GDP are going to fall at an annual rate of at least 15%. And then the optimists say we're going to have a recovery in the third and fourth quarter. But my numbers say that given the spread of the contagion, and by the way, 2 weeks from now, at this rate of spread of the contagion, in U.S. we're going to have 100,000 cases, okay? 100,000 cases. They're growing 30% per day. So in 1 week we'll be at 50, and in 2 weeks we're going to be at 100. So this implies that things are going to get worse, and the economy is not having a V-shaped recovery, is not having a U-shaped recovery, is not having an L-shaped recovery. Right now, the economy is like an eye. It's like a stick dropping faster than the global financial crisis, faster than the Great Depression. The Great Depression took 4 years, in 2933, that we got the Depression. Today, in a matter of a month, we've had a collapse of economic activity that is worse than the Great Depression. We've never seen something like this new in history. It's like an asteroid hitting the Earth and essentially leading a collapse of all economic activity. So that's what we're facing right now. So people talk about V, not even a U, not even an L. We're in an I. We're in a free fall right now. Let's be honest about it. I mean, people are still delusional, both the markets and people will talk about the V. What are they talking about?
Well, Nouriel, let me jump in, because I think people are finally waking up to the calls that have been made over the last couple of weeks. And respectively, I think we're going to leave the health predictions to the public health professionals, because it's really, really difficult to predict right now, Nouriel. And what I think we can do with you that would be typically really, really quite useful, actually, is to focus on policy and the policy response. Have you been encouraged by what you're seeing in Washington, D.C., not on the monetary policy side, but on the fiscal policy side?
Well, on the fiscal policy side, things are moving in the right direction. I've been saying for a while, you can use the entire monetary bazooka. Unless you have the fiscal bazooka, things are not going to be enough. But there is still talk. I mean, right now, maybe the Senate is going to pass the $50 billion of the phase 2. Now they're talking about the $1 trillion. How long is it going to take for that to be passed? How fast can we have checks given to everybody? Can we do it by early April or so on and so on? So if the fiscal bazooka is going to be really aggressively active, I think that's going to help the market. But there are two things that are going to keep the market pushing down towards stock market is falling 40 to 50%. One is the real economy is in free fall. Earnings expectations are being revised down, but the actual numbers are surprised severely on the downside. But the key policy response that is still failing is the health policy response, because the market can price risk. The market cannot price uncertainty. Uncertainty meaning a distribution is not normal, that has fat tail. And unless we do massive testing, we don't know how many people are sick. And unless we go to Chinese style of quarantine, meaning everybody is at home for a month or two, lockdown fully of everybody around the country, this thing is going to spread like wildfire. So markets are not going to reach the bottom until, in addition to the fiscal response, we have the real health policy response. We look around New York these days, people are still wandering around as if everything is normal. Yet the stores are closed. Everybody should be stuck in their homes like in Italy. You cannot get out of your home. We're not doing that. We're just kicking the can down the road. And given this uncertainty, and we're going to have 100,000 people sick 2 weeks from now, officially, the actual number might be higher, the market, given this uncertainty, can head only south. They cannot stabilize.
Nouriel, it's great to catch up with you. We've got to cut in, I'm afraid, because we've got to get to a commercial break. Nouriel Roubini there, joining us from Nouriel Roubini Macro Associates. The good news for me is that increasingly, over the last couple of weeks, on the policy side, and just in terms of everyday citizens, and I'm sure as you feel at home, people are taking this a lot more seriously. Coming up on this programme, the market-moving events you need to be watching. That'll be next in our trading diary. In the markets right now, equities lower by around about 2%. From New York, this is Bloomberg. Time now for the trading diary. What you need to be watching through this week. The coronavirus task force holding a news conference from the White House at 11 a.m. Later, the Mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, holding his own virus update. And in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson holding a news briefing on a virus response. Then at 2 p.m, President Donald Trump speaking with governors on the coronavirus coordination. And then on Monday, EU finance ministers will be meeting. We're about 25 minutes into this session. Equities are lower. Some breaking headlines in the last 20 minutes or so coming from the National Economic Council Director, Larry Kudlow. Let's get you up to speed. Here is Kelly Lance.
Yeah, John, Larry Kudlow has been speaking on Fox Radio, and he has been talking about what he sees as a V-shaped recovery coming in the summer or fall. And on the fiscal stimulus question, he's talking about the government possibly taking ownership in certain companies. He also says they're going to defer interest on student loans until 2021. He says that lending is going to be short-term and the liquidity is really the focus. And when asked about a fourth stimulus package, potentially, John, well, he says they will do whatever it takes. On a full shutdown of the U.S., he says the president is not there yet, John.
Kelly Lyons, thank you very much. That does it for us on this programme. Much more coverage still coming ahead on Bloomberg TV and on Bloomberg Radio. There is so much uncertainty out there right now, whether it's in markets, the economy, or public health for that matter as well. One thing I'll promise you over the next coming weeks is that when it comes to professionals, we'll keep them in their lane. If they're doctors, they can talk about public health. If they're economists, they can talk about the economy. And if they're the markets, they'll talk about the market. From New York City this morning, good morning. My thoughts with you all at home and beyond. This was the Countdown to the Open. This is Bloomberg TV.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases...
My gloves on and get my Clorox together.
Yes.
Hey, sold out nationwide.
Yes. Jim, we'll see you at 6, if not before. Thanks very much. Good Thursday morning, everybody. I'm Carl Quintanilla with Morgan Brennan and David Faber, all coming to you live from separate locations today as we put social distancing into effect as the New York Stock Exchange gets set to go all electronic beginning on Monday. Got some data to start the hour. Let's get to Rick Santelli for that. Rick.
Yes, our February read on leading economic indicators expected up 0.1%. That's exactly what has arrived, up 0.1%. Last month was really strong, up 0.8, and it was downgraded to up 0.7. So these are very solid numbers. But of course, maybe the effects of coronavirus haven't hit this particular data set yet. I will point out that the curve continues to steepen with short maturities under some pressure, longer maturities closer to unchanged. Carl, back to you.
All right, Rick, thank you very much. About 300 points or so off the initial lows on the Dow. Obviously, not a good morning once again, but Mike Santoli within a more, I guess, normal range if you're going back to the end of February here. And the volatility index trying to see, has some trouble here busting out of the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, there's some natural constraints on that, Carl. I mean, I do think you could look at yesterday's action. You could kind of make a list of things that showed a little bit lower selling intensity than, for example, we saw last Thursday. We've been, believe it or not, kind of hashing around a similar range for the last 5 or 6 trading days, even though it doesn't feel like it. It feels like we've traveled a farther distance. It doesn't mean it's strong. It doesn't mean it's setting a floor, but it does mean that there's a little bit of evidence of slightly less indiscriminate, slightly less heavy selling. And I keep talking about the VIX at these levels above 80. That statistically implies a daily move of 5 to 6 or something percent. So if you get something less than that, then that's going to be, believe it or not, a drag on the VIX itself. But I still think traders are watching closely outside of equities what's going on. The dollar rally, which seems kind of squeezy and forced and furious, and then the Fed's efforts to try and get other parts of the money markets and fixed income markets in better working order and kind of allow banks to share the Fed's balance sheet, loosen things up. So I think that's why it's touch and go, and everybody who thinks that a 1/3 drop in the value of U.S. equities in a month's time is overdone is still nervous about acting on that, because it just seems like things are fouled at the moment in terms of the operations of the markets themselves and the signals we're getting from them.
Right. When you're looking at, it's again, the 2008 playbooks here, Mike, are a little wobbly because the situations are so different regarding the participation of the banks, the origination of the problem to begin with. Obviously, it's a health concern this time. It's global. But are you seeing signs that correlations are beginning to break down between stocks, things that you would look for to get to a point where you could say we're marching our way toward a near-term bottom?
I think only tentatively are you seeing things like that. I don't think yesterday, even though we see like, Walmart being able to rally, we're redefining what kind of a rush to safety is right now. I do think we can kind of look for those things within the market after today's close. I mean, JP Morgan being down 6% to me is not compatible with a statement of confidence that we found some kind of core value. And that's what's going on this morning. So I don't think that the market needs to be any more scared in the very short term. I don't think the market needs to kind of have more liquidation to show that people are basically on their heels to stage some kind of a stand here and try to put in a floor. But there's a lot of other ingredients that aren't necessarily coming together. Nobody thinks we got into some kind of a core value. And you talk about 2008, one thing that's also similar is that we see whole industries very much going from being structurally challenged to now being, existentially threatened. And we're looking to Washington to see whether we should make bets on them or against them. So that's a similar feel right now, even if it seems as if the market's probably done enough on the downside to account for a lot of economic pain.
Yeah, Mike, I wonder, though, during the course of the day, some of the dislocations we see in various asset classes and the lack of correlation at all, these big risk parity funds that are running different strategies in different areas can't get anything hedged, it would seem to me. There's some liquidations taking place. I guess I'm just wrapping all this up and saying there are moves going on right now that have nothing to do with fundamentals, nothing to do with people's view. It's simply a result of moves to safety, inability to hedge, and funding stresses coming from all over the place.
Oh, exactly, David. I mean, if you're trying to read the signals coming from the various asset markets, and you were somebody who felt as if, hey, my treasury holding should act as a hedge to my equities, it's not working. So what do? You step back, you liquidate, you reduce exposures in general, and that's sort of a feedback loop that has been in motion for a little while right now. And you see also things like, plain vanilla fixed income bond funds trading at huge discounts to their net asset value just because of massive outflows or because the market-making function, arbitrage functions that normally just keep these things tight are not working. That's been going on for a few days right now, and I do think that's why the Fed, they're going to keep trying things, keep pulling things out of the toolbox and see if one or two of them work better.
Mike, in terms of where we have historically seen a relationship, and I'm thinking back to between different asset classes, and I'm thinking back to 2014, 2015, and 2016. The last time we saw a collapse in crude prices, we saw those types of prices moving in correlation with equities. I realize we're seeing a bounce in the energy complex, a little bit of one today, but given the fact that we're at such depressed levels, how much is that weighing on the broader market as well?
Yeah, it fits right in, Morgan. I mean, if you did a chart, I think we put one together, U.S. dollar index against gold, oil, corporate bond prices, and stocks. It's just dollar up and everything else down a lot. Now, the movement in crude oil is obviously kind of breathtaking in its magnitude and it has other drivers behind it, but it does nothing but reinforce and exacerbate the other things that are in motion, whether it's concerns about, the real economy and how it's going to function. I mean, people are talking about running out of storage for crude oil. It's pretty extraordinary stuff. So that, to me, is more just another pressure point on top of what we've already been trying to absorb.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to continue the markets conversation. With us now on the CNBC phone line, JP Morgan's chief economist Bruce Kasman and Citi's chief U.S. equity strategist Tobias Lefkovich. Good morning to you both. Bruce, I'm going to start with you. You just put out this note, and if I'm reading it correctly, you're expecting GDP in the U.S. in the second quarter to drop 14%?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, how do you get to that number?
Well, you basically shut everything down in March and April. Obviously, it's not just the U.S. It's happening in Western Europe. It's now increasingly happening across the world. So we have this enormous disruption that is not limited just to spending on entertainment and travel. It's spreading out to closing industries. And it does enormous damage, not just to GDP, but to labor markets. I think we saw the first step of that in today's jobless claim numbers. I don't think right now there is really any question that we're going to have an intense hit here and it's going to take second quarter growth down a lot. The real question is how long does this last and how do we recover from it? Right now we still have a decent recovery in the second half of the year, which incorporates a fading of the virus drags and an opening up of activity, but still some important lingering damage in credit markets and industries that have been hurt. The question right now is, can we stem the damage being done in a way that those lingering effects are just limited?
Yeah, Tobias, in the meantime, today, the S&P right now is basically right around the flat line. 2396 is the level currently that it's trading at. Just looking at one of your recent notes, you've drastically reduced your S&P target for the year to 2825 from 3375. So much lower, but still represents some upside. How are you forecasting? What is your modeling for that?
So we run about 9 to 12 different ways of kind of achieving that, Morgan. And what I would say is that we're starting from a much lower base, which is one of the problems. The earnings estimates as well. I mean, I share Bruce's comments about duration. How long does this last? And if it's 4 to 6 weeks, that's fine. If it's 4 to 6 months, there's still maybe some more pain. One of the things that's interesting to us is that when you look historically on trailing earnings as opposed to forward earnings, which are the place where we have the biggest difficulty forecasting, but on trailing earnings, between 14 and 16 times estimates, or actual results rather, has been kind of the second best place to buy the market over the past 80 years in terms of subsequent market performance. And that would be somewhere between 2,300 and 2,600 on the S&P. So, where we are right now does suggest valuation is already reflecting a lot of bad news. And even if we run numbers suggesting recessionary calls of maybe $130, $135 on the earnings estimates, we can still see, markets in the 2,400 to 2,500 range. In that context, there is some opportunity here. The problem is that sentiment is still, not in panic territory. In January, last comment here, our panic euphoria model was in euphoria, warning us 70% probability of downside to the market. We're fairly neutral now. We're not in panic level. And again, we're not measuring emotional states. We're measuring where, people are positioned. I know it's shocking, but we haven't gotten to people kind of giving up. Everyone's looking for that bottom. Everyone's looking for where the opportunities for the bounce back are. And I think there's got to be a level of disgust and revulsion towards equities to really hit that bottom.
And Tobias, I mean, for Goldman, for example, that number is 2,000 on the S&P mid-year. Do you have a number like that?
So we don't, but I would suggest that if you break and I'm not a chartist, I'm not a technician, but a lot of our clients do look at these charts very carefully, that if you break the 2340, 2350 levels that we saw in December 18, I know our technicians are talking about, potentially seeing, 2100 as kind of the next level where there can be some support. Again, it's not where we come from a fundamental perspective, but I can look at the chart just as easily as anybody else does, and I think there's an element of people saying, if I've got nothing else to look at, I'm going to look at the chart.
Yeah, Bruce, I'm curious what you think the Fed response right now, the fiscal response, all of these different phases in terms of bills that are being drafted by the federal government right now, some of these other actions, how much that could actually quell the worst of the economic damage here in the U.S. and how that factors in.
So I think what the Fed is doing is very important and very helpful, not just in easing policy, bringing rates to zero, but also in terms of trying to make sure markets are functioning, really stemming the tide of pressures in the Treasury market, now beginning to move into some other areas as well, commercial paper and specific. I think right now the really big issue is there's a lot of pain that's going to be felt in a very concentrated way in company space and people losing their jobs. And we need to not just get fiscal stimulus in the picture, we need to get targeted help. And the question I think we need to ask when we look at the package that's evolving in Washington is how quickly and how effective will those targeted benefits come. I think the jury is still out on that, and it will be an important factor in terms of how quickly and how strongly we can recover from what's going to be a big hole in the second quarter.
All right. I hope you're wrong. I really do.
I do too.
Tobias Lefkovich and Bruce Kasman, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are getting some headlines that definitely reinforce realism when it comes to hotels. That's the Marriott conference call. Seema Modi's got that for us this morning. Hi, Seema.
Hey, Carl, and that call was scheduled late last night. Marriott taking a number of bold steps here, halting share buybacks, suspending its cash dividend, and Mr. Marriott and CEO Arne Sorensen's pay for 2020. The company also reducing salaries for its senior executive team by 50%. All of this coinciding with a very sharp decline in shares of Marriott. At one point yesterday, it was down as much as 30% in yesterday's trade, which Sorensen did address on the call minutes ago.
Looking more deeply, the markets are understandably looking for assurance that we will survive. Why do I say this? Because there is no other rational explanation for the sell-off in our stock, even if you assume this crisis lasts many quarters. While none of us can know how long this will last, we think it very likely the crisis is well behind us, sometime in 2020 or early in 2021 at the latest.
Stock recovering a bit in today's trade. Now, the CFO of Marriott, Leeny Oberg, addressing balance sheet and liquidity concerns following the sharp decline it's seen in hotel occupancy around the world. Oberg mentioning the $4.5 billion revolving credit facility that Marriott has. So far, it's tapped about $2.5 billion of that to support the repayment of commercial paper. So that's something to keep in mind. Carl, in terms of some encouraging news, if you want to call it that, the company's saying that occupancy rates in China are beginning to rise, albeit slowly. They've gone from 90 hotels in Greater China closed at the height of the coronavirus outbreak, and right now they're under 30 closed today. Back to you.
Interesting, Seema. Coming on the heels of our interview with Qualcomm a few moments ago, it'll be nice if we can start to assemble some anecdotes like that. Dow up 186. You got crude at 2260, of course, coming off the third worst session ever. Senator Jim Imhoff joins us this morning along with Harold Hamm. Talk about where the energy complex goes from here. Gentlemen, appreciate your time very much this week. Release out of Continental today, a revised CapEx budget, $1.2 billion, a 55% cut. Expects cash flow neutral under 30 per barrel WTI. We'll get to foreign oil in a moment, but how would you characterize U.S. producers' ability to adapt in this very short time?
Well, you know, we can't adapt.
Yeah. And Harold, let me start with you.
Okay. Jim's right. You can't adapt to this type of scenario, so we do the best we can, and you know it's national security interest. That's what it is. The irony of this is that we're over there defending their national security. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, and here they are undermining ours over here. So we can't allow that to happen. They picked this time of this global pandemic, to try to undermine us. And, it just can't happen. I'll let Jim go from there.
Yeah, Jim, how does this carry on the Hill?
Well, I don't know how it carries on the Hill. I know how it carries in Oklahoma and in the United States. I'm the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I'm very much concerned. I don't want to get us in a position where we're dependent upon importing oil for our ability to defend America, to fight a war, to run our economy. And that's what we're faced with right now. And I'll be the bad guy and tell you that I sent a letter to Secretary Ross, Secretary of Commerce, and said that we would like to have him start the process of imposing 232 tariffs. Now, that's the national security tariffs that he has the case. First of all, he has to determine that dumping is taking place. Well, we know dumping is taking place, and we even know from some of the Russian people that there's a reason for this, and that is to get us to be dependent upon them. We can't let that happen. So I'm going to recommend that we impose the 232 tariffs to preclude that from happening, so that we don't become dependent upon Saudi Arabia or Russia or anybody else for our ability to run this country.
Harold, are there, given the environment we're in, it's hard to imagine this scenario, but what happens if there is recovery and we go from oversupply to undersupply? How much risk is there in that?
Well, you always deal with that. The good thing about this situation that Jim just talked about is that we have an agency that's charged with protecting American interests such as this. So that's a good thing. We have a Secretary of Commerce that understands and can deal with this quickly. And we've, talked with him, obviously, with the Armed Services Committee moving forward to take charge here, and also the Commerce Committee in the Senate. They can move very, very quickly and stop this situation that's been imposed on us.
Senator, I appreciate the national security argument in all of this, and certainly, you go back a couple of decades, and I think back to the OPEC oil embargo, for example, and we know just how important energy independence is to national security. And I recognize that we're at record levels of production here in the U.S. and we're exporting crude all over the world, et cetera. But in general, from a refining infrastructure standpoint, we still are importing quite a number of barrels right now because of how those refiners are structured and how also the ability to get crude to different parts of the country is set up right now. So what do you do about that situation?
We're a net exporter. That's where that's at. Yeah, we'll always import some because there's refineries that are owned by foreign entities. Canada has a number of those. And so you'll always be importing some barrels for some types of crude. But we're a net exporter, have been in the past year.
Yeah, Senator, I want to get your thoughts on this too, as you do bring this petition, this request for Section 232 to the Commerce Department.
Yes, well, that request, to answer a question earlier that was asked, I wasn't sure it was asking me or Harold, but, we can impose tariffs, and then we can change that. Now, if something should happen to the market where it's no longer necessary, obviously we wouldn't be imposing tariffs. We wouldn't want to do that. We just don't want to. As it is right now, we cannot continue to produce the oil that we have to run this country, and we would be dependent upon people like Russia and like Saudi Arabia. We can't let that happen.
Mr. Ham, it's David Faber. There are going to be any number of millions of people in this country who are going to need help in the not-too-distant future because they're losing their jobs. One can imagine them sort of asking, why should a company like yours, where you were an unhedged production company, be helped out more than any other? You are reaping what you sowed.
Well, David, first of all, we're not asking to be helped out. We have an agency that's their job. That's what they do. We're not asking for a handout. Nobody is. We've delivered something here that was unheard of, and that is bringing up production. national energy renaissance has been tremendous for the American people. We're going to have low prices, you know, for the foreseeable future. So we're not asking any handout. That's not what we're doing. But, you know, I think everybody realizes it's unfair what's going on.
Yeah, let me just respond to that, because, you know, if the industry goes down, nobody's going to be working. So that is their job. A lot of jobs are dependent upon our ability to be able to produce domestically, and that is very consistent to the things that we're voting on right now as we speak.
Senator, you know, you're on a very short list of senators who voted against this fiscal package, and I'm sure you'll take a lot of heat for it. You want to give your explanation as to why you did that?
Yeah, well, at that time, we're a state of small business. And with the way they handled small business, they said, you in the small business, you're going to have to support your employees. And you won't get reimbursed, though, until somewhere between probably a few weeks or a few months. And they can't survive that long. We spent all day in the last 5 or 6 days talking to our small employers, and we're trying to keep them alive. All we have to do is make a change, which we're going to make, I believe, today, on the vote today, where those individuals who are taking care of their employees will get reimbursed prior to the time that they are out the money. It's a matter of cash flow, not a matter of changing the amount of money.
Yeah, it's the devil's in the details.
We have right now, we are a huge, we have small businesses. You know, 99% of our activity is out of small business in the state of Oklahoma, and we're helping the employees and the employers, and that will be taken care of in the vote this afternoon.
Yeah, and certainly the devil's in the details, and employers are feeling the pain just as much as employees. Which brings me to my question for you, Harold, and that is the fact that Continental Resources did put out this update today. One of the things that was outlined is that the average rig count is going to go from 9 down to 3 in the Bakken. It's going to go to 4 from 10.5 in Oklahoma as well. When you see rigs come down or go up, that also translates directly and indirectly into quite a number of jobs. What are we already seeing in terms of some of those issues, some of those potential layoffs for workers in the oil patches right now?
Well, it's drastic. Halliburton just announced a large furlough yesterday. The good thing about it's a furlough, they're not laying those people off. You know, we're seeing it everywhere. Textron in Wichita, I think that layoff, furlough was 700,000 jobs. So, you know, it's across a lot of industries, and you know, these are contract people and out there with rigs and well service equipment and all that, and it's devastating.
Yeah. To put that in perspective, Mr. Ham, what is the oil price that you would need right now for Continental, not break even per well, but for you to actually earn a return at the corporate level?
Well, you know, we just put out a budget, you know, at this level that, you know, would be cash flow positive at $30. You know, we have great properties. We're a strong company. You know, we can weather the storm, but you know, it's we need to correct this situation. That's what we're trying to do. We've asked you know, through the Armed Service Committee, asked the Commerce Committee to fix this trade situation, and we believe they'll do it. This thing could end quickly. It's unheard of that somebody come in with a global pandemic and try to take advantage of American companies here and break this industry. We're not going to let that happen.
Harold, we appreciate your time as always. Senator, thank you as well. We hope to talk to you soon. Harold Ham and Senator Jim Inhofe.
Thank you very much.
Dow's up about 75 points. Morgan?
All right, Carl, thank you. As the U.S. is attempting to flatten the curve, the infection curve, our Meg Terrell is looking at what lessons we can learn from China and Italy. Meg.
Hey, Hey, Morgan. Well, we're all wondering, how long we'll have to be doing these measures and when we'll be able to see an impact from them. Now, RBC's analyst Kenan McKay, who usually covers biotech stocks, and his team taking their modeling skills to the epidemiology we can see coming out of China, Italy, South Korea, and other countries. They've got some great graphs here. You can see the red line. That's China's total cases. And you see they did begin to start flattening that curve in the middle of February. They note when the lockdowns began in China, first in Wuhan and then in the greater province of Hubei. They say it was about 25 days after that, about 4 weeks, that they started to see the curve flatten. Unfortunately, that's when the blue line starts to take off. That's global cases, and when we start to see the cases rise in Italy, other countries, and of course now here in the United States. So looking at lessons from Italy, they start to look at the intensive care capacity of that country and when the mortality in that country started to spike. And what they find, of course, is that inverse correlation between how many patients can be treated by intensive care as the case numbers rise and more severe patients are in the hospital, and that mortality rate spiking. Now, they created a calculation essentially for that capacity, and they plugged in the U.S. numbers. And what they found is under different scenarios, their base case scenario right now, that's the orange line here, we're going to hit the capacity in the United States of our intensive care units in early April. And that's with even more stringent measures than we currently have right now. That line on the right, the best case scenario, that's if we impose really strong restrictions, quarantines, making it even illegal to go outside, they tell me, in the epicenters of the outbreaks in the United States. Then they could really start flattening the curve. But these models assume we do more than we're doing right now, Morgan and Carl.
Wow, when a picture is worth 1,000 words. Meg Terrell, thank you. It's time now for a coronavirus update. Sue Herrera has that for us. Sue.
Indeed, I do, Morgan. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Let's start with an update on the global situation. Total confirmed cases have now risen above 222,000. The death toll has topped 9,100. Iran is the worst hit country in the Middle East. It is reporting 149 new deaths just since yesterday, bringing its total to nearly 1,300. It will now pardon 10,000 prisoners in an apparent attempt to combat the virus by reducing the prison population. We do have some positive virus news. China reported no new local infections today for the first time since the outbreak began. Officials did report 34 new cases, but they were infected outside of that country. Here in the U.S., Harley-Davidson has shut down most of its production plants through March 29th. The move follows closure announcements by many other automakers. J.P. Morgan Chase temporarily closing about 20% of its branches, about 1,000 locations, and it's reducing its staff in the rest of its branches. And in Las Vegas, McCarran International Airport has temporarily shut its air traffic control tower after a controller tested positive for the virus. The airport is open, but more than 40 flights had to be diverted. And TechCrunch is reporting telecom giant Charter Communications is telling its workers to keep coming to the office, despite at least one employee testing positive for coronavirus and other staff coming into contact with another person who had tested positive. A Charter spokesperson says it is following CDC guidelines. You can always get more on the coronavirus coverage that we have here at CNBC by going to cnbc.com. Guys, back to you.
Sue, thank you for that. We are seeing a remarkable bounce in a number of familiar names, but we have to mention Lyft and Uber. For more on this morning, we're going to check in with our Deirdre Bosa. Hey, Dee.
Hey, Carl, that's right. Uber shares, they are surging. They're up nearly 30% at this time. And this comes after Uber's executive team held a call, an analyst call this morning. CEO Dara Khosrowshahi essentially reassuring investors, saying that even if they see the worst case scenario, which he describes as gross bookings in the ride segments falling off 80% for the rest of the year and not recovering, he says that they still have enough cash on the balance sheet, that even if that were to happen, they would still have $4 billion. And there is a revolver, which is a short-term credit facility that they could use basically to survive this coronavirus outbreak if it continues. Now, he also said that in certain places like Hong Kong, they're already starting to see somewhat of a recovery. But he also said, though, that in some of its most major markets like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and others, he expects that the worst is still yet to come. Now, he also spoke a little bit about the Uber Eats, their food delivery business, which he says continues to grow. He says that even in Seattle, which has been extremely hard hit by the coronavirus, he says that that continues to grow. He underlined that they're taking care of their drivers, couriers, but that difficult decisions would have to be made in the coming months. He did not say what those were, but you'd have to think that there could be layoffs in the general area, the executive, the corporate side. So Uber, of course, is surging some 30%. Lyft, too, guys, this is interesting, is up about 15%, though it didn't hold that call. And remember that they do not have a food delivery business to make up for ride sharing. Back to you.
Deirdre, thank you. Deirdre Bosa, of course, on that remarkable move up, at least for now, in shares of Uber. Let's bring in Lori Calvasino, RBC Capital Markets Head of U.S. Equity Strategy, and Bob Dahl from Nuveen, the company's Chief Equity Strategist as well. Both of them join us on the phone. Good morning to you both. Lori, let me start with you. I think, you know, we peaked on what, around February 19th or so. It has been a rather dramatic fall since then. What are you expecting when it comes to the fears of a recession and what that's going to do in terms of earnings and how your models sort of respond from there?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, everyone. Just, you know, in terms of our forecast, we actually cut our number to 139 for 2020 EPS today, and that's a decline of about 16%. Now, we went through the modeling process. We updated our macro assumptions. But what was interesting to me about the output is that at the end of the day, it was in line with the median drop that we've seen in S&P 500 earnings. If you look at all the years dating back to 1990 that were affected by recession. So we think that's a good starting point. We, of course, know it's very difficult to forecast exactly what's going to happen right now. But we think it's worth considering that we at least have that kind of impact. And the reason why is we're really trying to listen to the market here. The market's been trading, you know, it hasn't broken below the 2,300 lows recently, but it's been trading around there. And that's in line, that percentage drop that we've seen of about 30% is in line with the average drop that we tend to see in the S&P 500 peak to trough in recessions.
You know, Bob, to Lori's point, though, or the one we've been making, I mean, this is not necessarily a market that right now is being or is trading on fundamentals. There are all sorts of different mechanisms in place or forced selling and the like that's going on. How do you even try and make sense of it? How do you try to even come up with some sort of idea of where we're going to be or whether this is, in fact, sometime worth buying?
Totally agree. It's all about the market internals, not about fundamentals yet. Fundamentals, of course, will matter, but as you guys talked about earlier, we need to see margin calls reduced. Forced selling, when you get 3 days in a row of the VIX over 80, all-time records, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, hedge funds are forced to reduce gross exposure. Risk parity funds are forced to sell. We've got credit markets that are seizing up from time to time. When we got last Thursday, that widening credit spreads even within the Treasury market. If we can calm those things down, and I think the market's starting to tell us that might be the case, we'll grab hold here and, you know, attempt instead of straight down, we'll have volatility, but in both directions, not just down. And I think 2350-ish on the S&P, we've gotten there or thereabouts a bunch of times, including December of 18. Maybe we're going to hold there, but you know, the forced selling and the credit markets, that's what I'm watching most carefully.
Yeah, you're not alone in that. Of course, the credit market's a key. But Bob, you know, it feels as though every time we've sort of sensed that at least there's, I don't even want to call it stability, but we're up a bit and we're actually seeing some stocks sort of rebound and find some stability. The next day, concerns about a deep recession or even, dare I use the word others are, depression come to the fore yet again, and everybody just sells everything.
You're absolutely right, David. I think people are finally beginning to mark their numbers to market. I mean, we're going to have, seems to me, in the second quarter, I'm not an economist, but I'd be surprised if the number wasn't minus 10 or worse in GDP. That's a whack. The question is going to become, when does the second derivative coronavirus cases peak so we can begin to get a handle on the other side? History of viruses, you get whacked hard, and then pretty quickly you start coming back. Oh, yeah, there will be residual effects that will last a long time. But if we can get past that, And we're starting to see that. The intensity of the put-call numbers, the upside, downside, the trend numbers. These are the things that I think in waterfall declines you've got to watch, and I'm starting to see less bad news there.
So, Lori, we have all the major averages right now moving higher. I'll say modestly higher. Dare I say that, but given all the dramatic moves we've seen overall in the month of March, the Russell 2000, the small caps are up 3% right now. They're outperforming. They've also been hit the hardest. When it comes to places that look potentially the most attractive for somebody who is potentially looking to get into this market now, given the sell-off we've seen, is it small caps? Is it mega caps and large caps? And how would you break that down across sectors?
Sure. So, the small caps are interesting from a valuation perspective, although right now, there's a lot of doubts about what valuations actually are. So it's a little bit tough to buy them on that basis. Small caps also historically get whacked the hardest when domestic economic views are eroding. And we're still in that mode for now. So I think long-term small caps offer opportunities. Short-term, I think it's a tough place to be. I'll tell you the place that we are really telling people to do some bargain hunting, and I'll stress that it's not in the airlines, but in the industrial sector broadly. We think this was a sector that was deeply attractive before we came into the coronavirus situation. Areas like machinery, multi-industry, road and rail, these are areas that will do well once we have an economic cycle again. There's nothing structurally broken about these areas. And we know that they're not going to do well in the short term, but we've been telling investors, if you want to do some bargain hunting, if you're really kind of a 3 to 5 year buyer, that's one place we'd look.
Yeah, Bob, I'm wondering if you would piggyback on top of that. I mean, there's headlines today from senators calling for infrastructure, which has been called for, we all know, for several years now, but in the wake of massive unemployment actually might carry more political water. And what might that mean for construction, infrastructure plays, commodity plays, when you consider the action in copper and iron the last few weeks?
I think, Carl, that will take time. We know it takes a long time to get that approval, get the design going, get the shovel in the ground. In the near term, I think we have to look at, okay, post QEs before, QE1, QE2, QE3, this is QE4. What sectors did well post that last time? Answer, technology and healthcare. Which ones did poorly? Utilities and REITs. And I think there's a differentiating factor. Infrastructure is going to take a long time.
Bob, I just want
Lori, hey, Lori. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Morgan.
Okay. Bob, I want to dig into whether the U.S. is still the best place to be for investors right now, or whether there are potentially greater opportunities, again, given the timeline, given risk appetite, if there are better opportunities in other parts of the world right now, especially as we do see markets move with coronavirus headlines.
So as long as we're in this defensive move, we know the U.S. is the most defensive of the big markets in the world, and therefore, along with a stronger dollar, the U.S. is doing reasonably well. On the other side of this, if we, in fact, do have a noticeable recovery, a bounce back from the, it's going to feel like depression-like levels, the more cyclical areas will do better, and that starts to speak of non-U.S. markets. We're a big growth market with a lot of defensive stocks. So for now, stick with the U.S.
Finally, Lori, give me a couple of names right now that you think have been overly penalized by the fear of recession / even worse, that are worth buying.
So unfortunately, I can't give you individual names for compliance reasons. But I would go back to the industrials. I would also say that if you want to just have sort of a set of stocks to watch, and I wouldn't necessarily pound the table on them and say they're buys today, but something we've been watching very, very closely is our list of the most popular stocks in hedge funds. And what we've noticed is that those names have been pretty resilient throughout most of this drawdown. But this week they started to see some pretty significant underperformance relative to the broad market. And we think that really coincided as we were starting to hear, concerns coming out of the hedge fund world, about some pod closures, about redemptions, outflows, that sort of thing. And also, frankly, just de-risking. Now, these these names, a lot of them are TIMT, secular growers. A lot of people's favorite stocks are on this list. And I would say, if you kind of want to trade this market and look for some longer-term opportunities, if we continue, to sort of see some of the underperformance that we saw earlier this week, if we continue to see that happen, I think you'll get some buying opportunities there, because I think once we come out of this to the other side, I think there will be this initial cyclical bounce. But then I actually do expect to sort of get back to this moderate growth type environment, and growth stocks can work pretty well in that environment.
Yeah, well, first things first, I guess, Lori. One thing really quick before we let you go. At 139 for 2020 EPS, is there anything that would make you reevaluate that number, either to the downside or the upside? Or is that number, you think, pretty firm for now for 2020?
I think it's a good working number for now. And, we said in the piece this morning that we're not immune to sort of the panic that we see that's going on around the street. We try to keep our emotions out of the process like everybody else. But just because it is sort of a dicey time, we're keeping what we call sort of a short-term significant coronavirus scenario in our back pocket. And that's where we expect more, where we model in rather more of kind of a negative 2Q hit to GDP that bounces back pretty quickly in 3Q. On that scenario, we actually come up with 158 EPS. So that's something we think you can keep in your back pocket if things start to look not as bad as we're modeling.
Okay, unclear when that is going to actually be the case. Lori and Bob, thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Morgan, over to you.
Thanks, David. Just getting a quick check on the markets here right now. We've been fluctuating between gains and losses for the major averages. The Dow and the S&P are currently trading in the red, albeit slightly. The NASDAQ, though, is the outperformer. It continues to hang on to gains of more than 1%. But let's get over to Rick Santelli in Chicago for his take and what he's watching today. Rick?
Thanks, Morgan. I'd like to welcome a special guest, Stanford Professor John Taylor, who, along with George Shultz, written an interesting book, Choose Economic Freedom: Enduring Policy Lessons from the 70s and 80s. I started to trade in the 70s. Welcome, Professor. I'll tell you what, I haven't read your book yet, but just by the title and skimming some of the things written about it, what an appropriate day. Here we are at a time where everybody wants the governments to help. Bank of England just cut rates further. They're going to be buying more. They have a special MP meeting. Christine Lagarde seems to have pulled back the notion she's not responsible for the spreads of sovereigns against the high-quality boons. But yet, nonetheless, all these policies are coming. Nobody's complaining. But we really haven't settled up from what we did in policy-wise 8, 9, 10 years ago in the last crisis. How do you see this landscape, Professor?
Well, I think that there's some recent changes that are promising. Maybe that's what we're referring to. Some of these liquidity facilities just announced late last night and the day before by the Fed for the primary dealers, commercial paper, even money markets. Those are specifically focused on problems in the markets. So I think those are maybe more promising than some of the more general things that you've mentioned. And also, I think that's the spirit behind the book. Choose economic freedom, choose things that work. Just don't throw the money away, and that can happen at times like this.
And I could agree more. Basically, we have 3 big programs by the Fed. I particularly like the short-term paper. I think that's very important, worked well in the last crisis. Now we have friend of CNBC, of course, you and I both know Larry Kudlow really well, top economic advisor, kind of put it out there that, if they're going to create advantages for some of these businesses that need it or special loans, that there may be a cost associated with that, equity positions. What do you think about that, kind of redoing what we did with GM, 10 years ago?
Well, I think some of the money should be focused on people that are clearly hurt, and that's going to be some low-income people. But I think the general spending lots of money that hasn't worked in the past. Quite frankly, 2008 was a program of spending money to people that didn't do much good. The economy kept coming down. So I'd like to see some promises that, hey, how about no tax increases for a while? How about some regulatory moratorium for a while? Just those could be a boost. And I'd like to see a little bit more talk of that. You don't see much of that at all at this point. Instead, it's really talk about the third phase. By the way, I think the second phase, paid sick leave, testing, payments, they make sense. But going on beyond that, it's a concern, and it hasn't worked in the past. So we hope they focus more on the problems.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Big bailouts of large corporations. Hey, certain big businesses in certain sectors may need some help. Think airlines here. But I couldn't agree with you more. The average Joe on the street maybe didn't get looked after as well in the last crisis, and certainly seems as though that we really are aiming to help that particular group of people that we all know, whether it's my parents, your parents, friends. Now, final thought. We are seeing some of these spreads and some of the bad barometers of what's been going on ease back a little. Professor, can we actually see the market start to grab here because maybe it overcompensated? Your kind of thoughts on where the GPS of pricing is versus what we know about the horrible effects of the coronavirus?
The global side is important, and you have seen some increase in the medium to even 10-year rates in the last couple of days. I think the exchange rate is, you want to look at that as well, because ECB has done some things. ECB made some big decisions yesterday. One thing I think is important, they didn't change the rate, and they have a specific analysis of why. The good piece, the chief economist of ECB just put out, Phil Lane, which explains it. I think more effort to explain what they're doing, that applies to the Fed as well, will be very, very good at this point, and Lane's a good example.
Excellent. Professor, thanks for your thoughts today. We will be having you back as this ongoing issue, of course, stymies both medical workers and, of course, those studying the economy. Morgan, back to you.
Rick Santelli, thank you. The Dow is down 228 points right now. The S&P is at 2383. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us.
They said it will never work. We still hear it all the time. But we built it anyway, client by client, market by market, for bonds, derivatives, money markets, ETFs, and equities, into a global electronic trading network that connects every part of the financial community. That's second to none. It will never work? Well, now it does.
Welcome to ETX Capital, a trading platform built on experience and trust. For over 50 years, we've given our customers stability and personalized services. London-based, we have a UK focus combined with a global approach. Ours is a personal, tailor-made service. Stay on top of the markets with ETX Capital, the award-winning personal trading platform.
People have been looking for love online for more than 2 decades, with the website Match.com launching in 1995 and the gay dating app Grindr launching in 2009. But advertising for a partner goes all the way back to the 17th century, shortly after the advent of the newspaper, when bachelors ran personal ads looking for a suitable companion. It's believed the first woman ran a newspaper ad in 1727, stating she was seeking someone nice to spend her life with. Lonely soldiers during the First World War advertised for pen pals. And in the 1960s, technology got involved. Operation Match was a computer dating service invented by Harvard undergraduates in 1965 that paired people up based on a questionnaire. That all changed in 2012 when Tinder invented the swipe. People swipe right when they like the look of someone, or left if they're not so sure. When 2 people like each other, it's a match, and they can then start messaging.
Welcome, everyone, to the closing bell.
It's the most important hour of the trading day.
20 minutes to go before the close. Do you think the volatility is going to stay with us?
When stocks move, when volume spikes.
The story that everybody on Wall Street was talking about.
Keeping you on the leading edge of what's driving the market.
Outlook for the sector is now not bad.
Minute by minute.
New highs on the usual suspects.
Wilfred Frost.
Positive territory again for all 3 of the indices.
Sarah Eisen.
There's the closing bell.
Closing bell. Weeknights on CNBC.
Welcome back on this Thursday morning. Goya Foods is seeing an obvious increase in demand for its products. Sales have quadrupled since March 11th, and they've distributed 23 million cans of beans to retailers since then. Joining us this morning is the president of Goya Foods, Bob Unanue. Bob, thank you for your time this morning. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
You ever seen a spike in demand like this?
You know,
this isn't our first rodeo. This is kind of what we do. You know, we consider ourselves first responders. So in times of hurricanes, we've always stepped up to the plate in Puerto Rico and in other places. But this clearly is an exceptional time. I wanted to say from the outset how extremely proud I am of our Goya family around.
Right now, rather than on corporate credit. That's an interesting line. We'll get more on the latest moves from the Bank of England next. This is Bloomberg. A second emergency rate cut from the Bank of England within the last few minutes. 15 basis points, taking us effectively down to the floor that the Bank of England has indicated it will not go below, because that would take us into negative rates. They're going to focus on buying govvie bonds as well, a significant increase in the QE program. Joining us now, Paul Gordon, Bloomberg Central Bank team leader here in Europe. Paul, is that it from the Bank of England in terms of what we can expect, a significant increase in QE, and we're down on the floor now? Is there any chance we go negative?
Well, according to the bank's own suggestions under Mark Carney and backed up by the new governor, Andrew Bailey, who's only 4 days into the job, no, negative rates are not their preferred tool. But nothing in this current environment can be ruled out. You do see that this is a relatively small rate cut because of that lack of firepower, 15 basis points, but £200 billion on the asset purchase facility, and the markets are taking that quite positively.
Paul, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Paul Gordon joining us on the latest from the Bank of England, joining us from Frankfurt. Let us turn our attention to what is happening in Chicago. Bill Baruch joining us now from Blue Line Futures. Bill, I want to get your take on how the market is functioning today. We've seen significant liquidity squeezes over the last few days. Clearly there is a shortage of dollars. What are you seeing today?
The S&P continues to battle at this December 2018 low, and I mean it is a heck of a battle. What you really do not want to see in the market is to close below there. We start closing below there, I think you really, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but then you really start to need to prepare to see the S&P down at 1550 to 1800. That really is the next big area of support, and if we continue below that 2300, it's going to see it.
Hey, Bill, how much of this is margin call versus real positioning from traders and investors?
Well, one of the big stories this week is that risk parity blow up, basically, the unwind of this trade. Large funds, institutions were long stocks, long bonds. And that's what you've seen here with the Treasury market coming in sharply. That is a lot of unwinding happening. There's a lot of blow ups, and there's still going to be some to come. So I think there's still more down the road.
Bill, any sign that we're seeing an ease in the dollar squeeze? We've seen the Fed extending the swap lines today to a number of new countries. Is that having an effect?
I would not step in front of the dollar right here. The dollar is breaking out above a almost 20-year trend line in the dollar index specifically. There is obviously support areas in the euro in this range here, 106 to 108. But ultimately, I mean, we could see euro heading towards parity with the dollar, given the momentum behind this move. Now, I'm not sitting here saying you need to be long the dollar right now, but I sure would not get in front of it and try to fade this move at this point in time. And it's doing some interesting things. It's adding pressure to commodities out there. Yesterday, obviously, as the dollar melted higher, we saw crude oil take the next leg. We saw gold not follow. We've seen a number of commodities struggle as well.
Bill, we're going to leave it there. We always appreciate your time. Thank you very much for it today. Bill Baruch joining us from Blue Line Futures out of the CME. Alex.
Don't step in front of that rally. Fair point. All right, coming up, we're going to bring you the White House briefing on the coronavirus. That's set to begin at the top of the hour. As you're taking a look at markets here, where you've seen some whippy action in the S&P, you're now seeing we're down by about 0.4%. We were up, we were down, we were flat, we were down. It continues to be that volatility unwind. The NASDAQ, though, really holding up by over 1% as the VIX is about 79. Guy?
Let's take a look at where we are here in Europe. We are off our lows when it comes to the equity story. The big news, obviously, over the last hour has been coming out of the Bank of England. We have seen the pound being absolutely shoved lower, but the FTSE now higher, up by 0.5%. This is Bloomberg.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility.
He's going to be using those authorities anytime soon. He just wanted to invoke the Defense Production Act in the short term so that it's there in case he needs it, Carl.
Eamon, it's John Fort. But by my count, it's been about a week since the last gasp of real partisanship that I saw when McConnell and McCarthy were talking about the House bill, calling it an ideological wish list and whatnot. I think the lawmakers pretty quickly started getting on the same page and getting into a different posture. But from where you sit at this point, is it clear where there might be any types of divides around what types of measures Congress is willing to take? I know the payroll tax cut was on the table for a bit, then off the table. But beyond that, are there areas where Democrats and Republicans clearly differ at this point?
You know, it's unclear right now. You saw Chuck Schumer out earlier today and yesterday saying that what Democrats want is a real focus on the worker. He said if there's going to be bailouts, we want to make sure that the focus here is on labor and the workers, the people who might get hurt, and not just bailouts that will benefit executives. So I think there's a split in terms of the attitude there. But I think it's slowly dawning on lawmakers the scale of the crisis that they face. The idea that the automakers shut down production entirely. You're seeing entire cities going dark in terms of economic activity across the United States. This is just something that we haven't seen before, and it's taking lawmakers a while to sort of adjust their mental aperture here to understand exactly what it is that they're looking at and realize that, you know, the previous waves of economic difficulty and national challenge that we've seen have been different in terms of the type and also in terms of the scale. And so what's going to be required here is entirely different again as well. So all of that's being worked out right now. I know the Democrats would like what they call a four corners negotiation with the top four leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans negotiating. So far, the White House's approach here has been to negotiate directly with Senate Republicans. You saw Mnuchin and Kudlow go and talk to Senate Republicans. Democrats want to be in on that conversation from the get-go. That hasn't really happened yet, but you're seeing White House officials praising and thanking Nancy Pelosi, which is something we just certainly couldn't have even imagined 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, Eamon, I mean, as we await the start of this task force briefing and